On a grey sea under a sky the colour of hammered iron, a narrow ship rises and falls between cold swells. Its sail is damp with spray, its timber seems dark with tar, its carved prow cutting toward a shoreline that does not yet know what is coming. In the half-light, shapes gather behind the gunwale shields, wool cloaks, spears held close so the points do not flash too soon. Then one figure steps into view, and without a word the mind supplies the detail it has been trained to expect. 2 great horns curve from his helmet, black against the mist. They make him instantly recognisable. They make him seem wilder, more ancient, more terrifying than an ordinary man in an iron cap ever could. He's the Viking of posters, cartoons, opera stages, football mascots, toy boxes, advertisements, schoolbooks, festival costumes, and 1,000 screen images. He has sailed so deeply into modern memory that it can feel almost absurd to imagine him without those horns. Yet the moment the ship reaches solid historical ground, the horns begin to fade. The real shores of the Viking Age are scattered with objects that have survived fire, rot, burial, ploughing, looting, salt water, and more than 1,000 winters. Iron sword blades corrode into rough shadows of themselves. Shields usually vanish apart from their metal bosses. Ships survive only in rare graves, wrecks, or impressions in soil. Human bones, beads, buckles, combs, coins, weights, tools, rivets, broken weapons, fragments of cloth and splinters of carved wood offer stubborn. Incomplete glimpses of people who lived in Scandinavia and crossed outward from it, between the late 8th and 11th centuries. Among those fragments, archaeologists have sought the equipment of warriors, what protected their heads, what marked rank, what made one man visible in the crush of a raid or battle. Horned helmets, the most famous piece of Viking equipment in the modern imagination, refuse to appear where they should. No convincing Viking Age combat helmet fitted with horns has emerged from a warrior grave, a ship burial, a battlefield deposit, or a securely understood hoard. What survives in the record suggests not a missing army of horned raiders, but a modern certainty built over an ancient silence. That silence does not mean the people of the North were less striking than legend makes them. A raid seen from the shore in the 9th century needs no theatrical ornament to be frightening. A monastery lookout, a farmer near an estuary, or a trading community on a vulnerable riverbank would not be comforted by the discovery that approaching warriors wore no horns. The terror is in the speed of the arrival, the shallow drafted ships moving where larger vessels cannot follow. The sudden concentration of armed men, the deliberate use of weather and surprise. Their faces may be weathered, bearded or clean-shaven according to taste and circumstance. Their hair may be combed with a care that later stereotypes prefer to forget. Their clothing may be brightly dyed if status allows, held by brooches, belted around tunics, wrapped in heavy cloaks against rain and sea wind. Some carry round shields painted or simply worn bare by use. Some have axes meant as much for work as for violence. Some have spears, the common weapon of a world in which a good sword can represent unusual wealth. A helmet, for those who possess one, is protection rather than spectacle iron shaped to turn a blow, not a pair of handles inviting an enemy to catch, wrench, or strike it aside. And still the horns remain. They remain because history is not remembered only through excavated metal and careful dates. It is remembered in silhouettes. A Roman is given a crested helmet, a pirate, a black flag, a medieval king a crown even when he should be sleeping, and a Viking 2 enormous horns that announce him before he has taken a single step. Such images work because they are fast. They compress an entire imagined world into a single outline. Remove the horns and the man becomes harder to classify at a glance. He may resemble any warrior from the early medieval North, or any actor in rough wool standing beside a wooden boat. Give them back, and the mystery is solved instantly. He is no longer merely a Scandinavian sailor, trader, settler, raider, mercenary, farmer, explorer, craftsman, enslaver, or poet. He is a Viking, simplified into a shape so powerful that it has nearly replaced the past itself. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the question hidden beneath those horns is larger than a mistake about costume. It is a question about how false memories are made, how generations can become attached to an image the people of the past would scarcely recognise, and how easily one of history's most famous cultures can be transformed into a character in a costume drama. The Horned Viking is not simply wrong in the ordinary sense. He is a clue. He tells us something about what later centuries wanted the Vikings to be savage enough to frighten, heroic enough to admire, pagan enough to appear outside ordinary civilization, and visually magnificent enough to fill a stage or sell a story. Picture instead a burial mound in Norway, long after the funeral fire has cooled and the living have moved on. Soil closes over iron and bone, wood collapses, textiles stain and disappear. A warrior's belongings remain underground through the conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity, through kingdoms becoming nations, through wars and famines and farm boundaries slowly shifting across the landscape. When such burials are eventually disturbed or excavated, the finds do not arrive as clean illustrations from a book. Metal may be fragmented, an object may be misidentified for decades. Its original setting may have been damaged before any trained observer sees it. Evidence of the Viking Age is precious partly because so much has been lost. Scholars still debate the meaning of many rare images and unusual finds, especially when those objects seem ceremonial, symbolic, or only partially preserved. Yet uncertainty is not permission to fill every gap with whatever image has become familiar. On the matter of ordinary Viking warriors riding seas or entering battle in helmets mounted with great horns, the material record gives no solid support. This creates a peculiar kind of mystery. Many historical mysteries begin with an object that should not be there: a buried treasure, a ruined settlement, a body in a bog, a carved sign no one can read. This one begins with an object that seems to be everywhere, except in the time and place to which it supposedly belongs. The horns tower above souvenir shop shelves in Copenhagen and Oslo. They sit on comic Vikings with braided beards and cheerful mugs of ale. They decorate fans, logos, plastic helmets, movie promotions, birthday costumes, and illustrations intended to summon the North in a single stroke. Children may meet the horned Viking before they learn that the Viking Age even has dates. Long before they encounter a museum case or a careful reconstruction, the image feels settled. By the time someone explains that the helmets are almost certainly not what Viking warriors wore, the correction sounds like the strange claim, and the invention feels like memory. It is tempting to dismiss all this as harmless. After all, nobody expects every fictional pirate to be a faithful reconstruction of an 18th century seaman. A horned helmet is a theatrical accessory, and theatre is allowed to exaggerate. But the Viking image has never been entirely harmless or entirely playful. Across different times, the people called Vikings have been turned into whatever later audiences needed bloodthirsty barbarians sent as punishment by God, heroic forefathers. Symbols of masculine strength, racial fantasies, adventurous explorers, comic brutes, freedom-loving settlers, ruthless invaders, fashionable rebels. Some of these portrayals contain pieces of truth, none contains the whole society. The horns sit on top of that process like a bright sign, showing where history has been decorated, sharpened, and bent toward a modern desire. To understand why they appeared is to follow a trail not only through Viking Scandinavia, but through the imaginations of those who came after. For the people living along northern coasts more than a millennium ago, identity does not come in the simple package later generations prefer. The word Viking itself does not neatly mean every Scandinavian person alive in the period. Most people never charge ashore with weapons. They sow grain where short summers allow it, tend animals through difficult winters, mend nets, prepare food, repair boats, forge nails, weave sails, settle disputes, trade small necessities, and watch the horizon for ships that may bring news, goods, kin, demands, or danger. Some travel seasonally, some move abroad permanently, some seek silver, land, honour, service in foreign courts, or opportunities that leave grief behind them. Their world is connected to rivers, islands, market towns, farmsteads, royal halls, sacred places, foreign coins, imported glass, Arabic silver, Irish metalwork, Baltic amber, and stories carried from harbour to harbour. A helmet with horns cannot explain that world. In some ways, it hides it. Even the famous violence of the Viking Age becomes distorted by the costume. Horns make the raider look almost non-human, like a beast erupting from an age of darkness, rather than a person participating in systems of wealth, power, feud, slavery, ambition, kingship, and maritime technology. That does not soften what raiders did. Communities were attacked, people killed, captives sold, religious houses stripped, and fear spread through regions suddenly exposed to men who could arrive from the water and depart before retaliation gathered. But the truth is more unsettling when the raider is understood not as a fantasy monster, but as a trained, calculating human being from a sophisticated and competitive society. His danger does not depend on horns. It depends on ships, information, cooperation, weapons, opportunity, and the willingness to use violence efficiently. Somewhere between that living northern world and the Viking displayed in modern imagination, two curved projections were added to the helmet, not by the raiders themselves, at least not in the familiar battlefield sense, not by clear Viking Age archaeological evidence. They entered by a far stranger route, through older symbols, ambiguous images, medieval memory, antiquarian enthusiasm, nationalism, art, theatre, mass printing, and eventually the irresistible machinery of popular culture. Before that trail can be followed, the silhouette must first be held against the cold light of the world it claims to represent. There, on a wet deck in the North Sea, with the sails straining and the coastline drawing nearer, the horns are the least believable thing in view. The sea is real, the ship is real, the fear on the shore is real, the men approaching from the mist belong to history. But the famous outline above their heads belongs to someone else's dream of them. A dream so old now that it has learned to disguise itself as fact. The dream becomes easier to recognise once the world beneath it comes into focus. The men on that imagined deck are not emerging from some blank northern wilderness, fully formed as raiders with salt in their beards and axes in their hands. Behind them lies a landscape of farms, inlets, forests, islands, workshops, halls, marketplaces, shrines, burial grounds, and family obligations. A landscape difficult enough to demand skill and connected enough to reward ambition. In the centuries now called the Viking Age, roughly from the first recorded Scandinavian raids in the late 8th century to the consolidation of Christian kingdoms in the 11th, the people of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and neighbouring Norse settlements live in a world shaped by water. The sea is not a barrier at the edge of their lives. It is a road, a source of food, a testing ground, a route to wealth, and sometimes a grave. It carries iron, timber, wool, walrus ivory, furs, amber. Enslaved people, silver coins, weapons, news, stories, marriage alliances, royal demands, and the dangerous possibility of sudden fortune. Most Scandinavians do not spend their lives attacking monasteries. The great majority work the soil, raise livestock, fish rivers and coasts, cut hay for winter fodder, preserve meat, repair roofs, spin wool, weave cloth, carve wooden vessels, make iron tools, and negotiate the delicate relationships that allow a farm and household to survive. Life is governed by season. Spring brings preparation and uncertainty. Summer brings sailing, trading, raiding, gatherings, legal assemblies, and the exhausting work of producing enough before cold closes in again. Autumn tightens every household around harvest and slaughter. Winter gathers people indoors around smoke, firelight, craft work, storytelling, feasting when supplies permit, and the calculations of what the next year might demand. A successful farm is not merely a home. It is the base from which status is built. Ships are equipped, guests are received, followers are fed, marriages arranged, debts collected, and reputations maintained. A man who leaves on a voyage carries more than a weapon. He carries the expectations of those who have provisioned him, those who may profit if he returns, and those who may be ruined if he does not. The word most modern people use for this entire society is itself misleadingly narrow. To go Viking appears to have referred to a kind of overseas expedition, often involving raiding, rather than simply being the permanent identity of every Scandinavian child, farmer, craftswoman, trader, chieftain, or shepherd. Later habit has widened the label until it covers an age, a people, and almost any Norse object from the period. That convenience is difficult to avoid. But it quietly feeds the horned helmet myth. When a complex society is reduced to a single profession, it becomes natural to dress everyone as a theatrical warrior. The ordinary tunic, the loom weights in the house, the carefully mended fishing net, the legal settlement reached at an assembly, and the trader testing a silver weight all disappear behind the same loud costume. Yet what survives in the record suggests that the energy of the Viking Age comes precisely from this mixture. Farmers who can sail, traders who can fight, warriors who understand commerce, rulers who depend on gift-giving, craftspeople whose work enables distant voyages, and households bound into networks stretching farther than their grandparents might have imagined. The ships are at the heart of that widening world, built from overlapping planks secured with iron rivets, flexible enough to endure rough water and shallow enough to reach beaches and rivers. Scandinavian vessels are among the great practical achievements of early medieval Europe. Not every ship is a sleek war vessel packed with armed men. There are cargo ships with broad hulls made to carry goods, fishing boats shaped for local waters, ferries and working craft rarely celebrated in heroic stories. But the fast longship becomes the most alarming expression of the technology because it combines mobility with surprise. It can cross open water, enter an estuary, draw close to shore, disgorge men quickly, and leave with speed. The ship does not create the urge to seek wealth abroad, but it changes what that urge can accomplish. A coastal monastery once protected by distance and warning time becomes reachable. A market far across the Baltic becomes part of a trader's mental map. A chieftain with followers and ships can turn local influence into overseas opportunity. A young man with limited prospects at home may see the horizon less as an ending than as a wager. The first shock recorded by outsiders comes in places unprepared for such speed. In 793, the assault on the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria, enters Christian memory as a terrifying sign of disorder. It is not necessarily the first encounter between Scandinavians and Western Europeans. Trade, travel, and smaller violence existed before chroniclers took special notice. But Lindisfarne becomes a landmark because a sacred community, wealthy in objects and vulnerable by location, is violently exposed to men arriving from the sea. In the decades that follow, raids strike around the British Isles and the Frankish world. At first, many seem seasonal and opportunistic. Later, fleets grow, armies overwinter, tribute is demanded, settlements are seized, political weaknesses are exploited, and Norse leaders begin to rule territories rather than simply plunder them. The raider and the settler are not separate species. One may become the other when conditions favour staying. Eastward, another network takes shape along rivers rather than Atlantic coasts. Scandinavian travellers, many associated with the Swedish sphere and later called Rus in Eastern sources, move through the river systems of what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, and connecting the Baltic with the Black Sea and the Caspian world. They trade in furs, wax, honey, weapons, luxury goods, and human captives, joining routes that lead toward Byzantium and the wealthy Islamic lands. Vast quantities of Arabic silver coins discovered in Scandinavian soil testify to the reach of these connections. A farmer bearing silver on an island in the Baltic may possess coins struck far beyond any place he has seen, brought north through exchanges involving languages, rulers, risks, and journeys measured not in miles but in seasons. This is one of the stranger truths concealed by the stereotype of the horned barbarian. The Viking Age North is not sealed off at the end of Europe. It is threaded into a world system, hungry for foreign metal and responsive to distant markets. Silver has a special force in that society. Coins are not always valued primarily because of the faces or inscriptions stamped on them, nor because they represent an official Scandinavian currency. Silver can be cut, weighed, tested, exchanged, melted, worn, displayed, hidden, or given away. Hoards contain coins alongside arm rings, ingots, brooch fragments, chopped metal and ornaments, pieces accumulated as wealth that is portable and visible. A chieftain's power is strengthened by the ability to reward followers. A successful voyage produces not merely private gain, but treasure that can be turned into loyalty, hospitality, marriage arrangements, equipment, reputation, and further voyages. The glitter of imported silver helps explain why men risk storms, disease, violence, shipwreck, capture, and years away from home. It also reveals a society in which warfare and trade are often uncomfortably close. Goods may be purchased at one harbour and stolen at another. Captives may be taken in an attack and sold through commercial routes. An object admired in a Scandinavian grave may have passed through hands marked by conquest, exchange, diplomacy, or enslavement, and often the evidence remains incomplete. Slavery is one of the harder realities to fit into popular admiration for Viking adventure. Norse raiders do not merely gather treasure and sail away with heroic songs waiting for them at home. They take people, men, women, and children seized in raids can be forced into labour, absorbed into households, exchanged, transported, or sold into wider markets. Enslaved people work farms and homes, accompany expanding settlements, and form part of the economic foundation that supports free households and elite ambition. Their lives are much harder to recover than those of people buried with ships, weapons, jewellery, or ceremonial goods. They leave fewer objects identified as their own and fewer voices preserved in later literature, yet they are not marginal to the Viking Age. They are among its human costs, a reminder that mobility and opportunity for one group often mean uprooting and terror for another. The Viking world is impressive in its reach, but it is not innocent in its methods. Nor is it politically simple. Scandinavia is not yet a landscape of modern nation-states with stable borders and one unquestioned authority in each region. Power is layered and shifting. Local magnates command households and retainers. Kings compete to gather followers, control routes, demand tribute, establish towns, sponsor religion, and claim territories whose loyalty may change quickly. Assemblies known as things provide arenas where free men pursue legal disputes, alliances, compensation, inheritance, reputation, and political support. Violence exists, but it is often surrounded by rules, settlements, obligations, and the constant danger of feud. Honour is not an airy poetic idea. It affects whether a man can attract support, whether a household can defend its interests, whether insult requires response, and whether generosity in a hall creates bonds that will matter when ships are launched or enemies arrive. The warrior who stands beside a chieftain in one summer may be there because of gifts, kinship, promise, debt, shared revenge, or the expectation of richer rewards to come. The hall makes this order visible. Imagine a long timber building glowing from within during a northern night, smoke finding its uncertain path above the central fire, benches crowded with people wrapped in wool, wet cloaks steaming as they dry, bowls and drinking vessels passing between hands. Here news is carried from overseas, here silver is displayed and distributed, here poetry magnifies deeds, genealogies justify claims, and travellers report foreign lands in accounts that grow sharper or stranger with retelling. A fine weapon may be admired, not only for its killing power but because it speaks of the giver and receiver. Imported objects proclaim distance crossed and contacts made. Glass, silk, decorative metalwork, carved gaming pieces, beads and jewellery show an appetite for refinement as well as display. The world of the Vikings is often imagined as grim brown mud broken only by red violence. Yet archaeological finds point to dyed textiles, skilled ornament, carefully groomed bodies, fine woodworking, and taste expressed through whatever resources position could command. Personal appearance matters. Combs are common finds in Norse settlements and graves, fashioned from bone or antler with deliberate skill. Grooming equipment, jewellery, brooches, beads, buckles and textile evidence do not support the picture of a population indifferent to how it looked. Outsiders sometimes notice the attractiveness or cleanliness of Scandinavians, with irritation rather than admiration, especially when foreign men appear capable of attracting local women. Clothing signals sex, rank, regional style, trade contact, and wealth. The exact reconstruction of garments can be difficult because fabric rarely survives well, but enough remains to show that this was not a society uniformly dressed in shapeless animal skins. Wool is essential. Linen appears where resources allow, and colour can be produced through dyes requiring labour and knowledge. A bright cloak or finely made brooch may command attention as surely as any weapon. The horned helmet, by comparison, belongs to a visual language so blunt that it erases the more intimate signs by which Norse people actually declared who they were. Religion, too, inhabits the landscape rather than merely decorating the warrior. Before Christianity spreads and eventually becomes bound to royal power, many Scandinavians live within a sacred world populated by gods, ancestors, spirits, fate, ritual obligations and powerful places. Odin is associated with wisdom, poetry, death, sorcery and the terrifying uncertainty of victory. Thor, wielding his hammer, protects against destructive powers and appears with particular force in amulets worn during a period when Christian crosses also begin to circulate. Freya and Freya are tied to fertility, wealth, desire, prosperity and forms of magic. Belief is not preserved as a single neat system recorded by impartial witnesses. Much of what is known comes from later Christian writers, poetry transmitted after conversion, place names, amulets, burials, sacrificial traces and images whose precise meaning scholars still debate. A grave furnished with weapons, jewellery, food, animals or a ship may express identity, status, memory and ideas about death, but no single explanation fully accounts for every burial custom across the Norse world. Ritual and warfare can overlap without turning every warrior into a horned priest of battle. Some men may cultivate associations with Odin, frenzy, animal strength or elite warrior identities. Some images suggest masked or unusually adorned figures in settings that are not easy to interpret. Ceremonial clothing may have existed that would be wildly impractical aboard a crowded ship or in the chaos of close combat. But extraordinary ritual imagery should not be mistaken for the normal appearance of raiding bands any more than a bishop's ceremonial headwear describes the clothing of every medieval Christian soldier. The distinction matters because later centuries will seize upon rare symbols and turn them into uniforms. Long before that confusion hardens, the Viking Age itself already contains enough spectacle ship burials raised under mounds, carved beasts twisting across metal and wood, funeral ceremonies that could consume enormous resources, halls rich with gifts and loyalty, and voyages that take northern travellers from Greenland to Constantinople. By the late 10th and 11th centuries, the world that made the first great raiding decades possible is changing. Scandinavian rulers are establishing stronger kingdoms, minting coins, founding or controlling towns, converting to Christianity, building churches, and tying themselves more firmly to European systems of monarchy and faith. Norse settlers have reshaped parts of England, Ireland, Normandy, the North Atlantic Islands, Iceland and Greenland. An expedition even reaches the edge of North America, leaving traces at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland centuries before Columbus. The word Viking begins to belong more clearly to an earlier pattern of movement and violence, even though its memory remains potent. The age does not end in a single moment, and the habits of seafaring, warfare and trade do not disappear. But the societies of the North are becoming something later chroniclers more readily recognise as kingdoms within Christian Europe. This is the world that must stand behind the approaching ship, not a cartoon horde made identifiable by horns, but a society of extraordinary movement and sharp contradictions, capable of fine craft and ruthless capture, careful law and sudden violence, poetry and commerce, cultivation and conquest. Its people carry their real markers of identity in cloth, metal, ships, silver, weapons, ritual objects, hairstyles, brooches, amulets, household ties, and the reputations attached to their names. The helmet, where it appears at all, belongs within that practical and status-conscious material world. To see what was actually placed on a warrior's head, the imagined ship must draw closer, close enough for the theatrical outline to vanish, and the scarce, battered, stubborn evidence of iron to take its place. Close enough now, the ship's deck ceases to be an emblem and becomes a working space crowded with difficult realities. Salt water slicks the planks. Oars, lines, shields and bundles must all be kept where they can be reached without becoming hazards underfoot. Men who may soon run through surf or climb a muddy riverbank need clothing that permits movement, survives wet weather, and does not turn every stumble into disaster. The warrior who steps ashore is not dressed to satisfy the distant gaze of a later audience. He is dressed according to what he owns, what his household can produce, what a patron has given him, what trade has placed within reach, and what experience has taught him might keep him alive. If his appearance carries menace, it is because every item has a practical intimacy with violence, the shield scarred at its rim, the spear balanced in his hand, the axe worn smooth where fingers close around the shaft, and, on the heads of only some among them, an iron protection shaped not for spectacle, but for the blunt arithmetic of survival. Begin with what lies beneath the weaponry, because even a warrior enters battle first as a clothed human body. A Norse man of means might wear a linen undershirt or a linen shirt beneath a woolen tunic, with trousers secured by a belt and legs protected by wraps or close-fitting fabric against cold, brush and travel. Shoes are made from leather, practical and relatively soft by modern expectations, vulnerable to wet ground and heavy wear. Over the tunic comes a cloak when weather demands it. Fastened by a brooch or pin, invaluable aboard a ship or in camp, but something to manage carefully when movement turns urgent. The colours need not be dull. The northern world can produce yellows and reds from plant dyes, and wealthier clothing may appear in richer blues or other valued hues whose materials or labour make them costly. The image of every Viking clothed entirely in mud-coloured roughness is as misleading, in its quieter way, as the horned helmet. A man going into danger may be surrounded by woven colour, patterned trim, fine buckles, decorated strap fittings and objects intended to show that he belongs to someone important, or has become important himself. Nothing about such clothing makes a man immune to weapons. Wool warms him, and sometimes helps cushion equipment, but an axe blow, spear thrust or sword cut is not persuaded by a handsome tunic. Modern reconstructions often imagine thick padded garments beneath armour, because later medieval warriors used forms of textile protection, and because the logic of cushioning seems obvious. Yet for the Viking Age North, the evidence remains incomplete. Quilted or heavily padded protection may have been used in some form, especially by people who could not acquire metal armour, but organic material usually vanishes, and certainty is difficult. Leather armour occupies an even more powerful place in modern costume design panels: straps, dark studded surfaces that immediately announce a hardened fighter. The surviving evidence does not justify making such leather body armour the standard uniform of Viking warriors. Leather is necessary for belts. Shoes, scabbards, harness, shield fittings, and countless ordinary purposes, whether it regularly formed the dramatic armoured jackets imagined on screen, is a much less secure claim. The most dependable protection for many warriors is not worn around the body at all. It is held in the hand, the round shield. A Viking Age shield is usually built of wooden boards, often thin enough to keep it usable, with a central iron boss sheltering the gripping hand. Its edge may be strengthened, and its face may carry hide, paint, or decoration, though preservation rarely gives a full portrait of how common each treatment was. In peaceful display, a row of overlapping shields along the side of a ship can look almost ceremonial, a repeating rhythm of circles against the hull. In violence, the shield is personal shelter, moving wall, striking surface, burden and lifeline at once. It catches missiles, blocks cuts, hides the body for an instant during approach, and creates the narrow protected space from which a spear or blade can work. Shields break, edges splinter, boards are cut and punched. A warrior who survives a serious encounter may owe more to the timber circle on his arm than to any glamorous weapon he carries. This matters because modern imagination often reverses the priorities. It gives its Viking an extravagant helmet, massive armour, and an oversized axe, while the historically ordinary shield becomes a decorative background item. For men who actually faced injury at close range, the hierarchy is less theatrical. Shields are widespread because wood is more available than large quantities of worked iron, and because a shield can protect an enormous part of the body. Spears are widespread because they are efficient, versatile, and require far less costly metal than a sword. A spear allows a man to threaten an opponent before the opponent can bring a shorter weapon into play. It can be used over or around shields, carried on foot, thrown in some circumstances, and made in forms ranging from modest tools of war to richly furnished status objects. An axe may be a specialised weapon, or a tool turned toward combat. And some later Viking Age axes become fearsome long-shafted implements capable of tremendous force. Swords carry a special prestige. They require skill, metal, time, and wealth. Fine examples may have decorated hilts, patterned blades, or imported origins, and they can travel through generations as gifts, inheritances, trophies, or grave goods. To have a sword is not merely to have a sharp object, it may be to possess a visible piece of reputation. Over clothing, above the shield, and behind the weapons lies the rarest defensive luxury mail. A mail shirt is made from thousands upon thousands of interlinked iron rings, a flexible metal skin intended to resist cuts and reduce the damage of some strikes. Although it cannot make a body invulnerable to impact, crushing blows or well-driven points, it is heavy, demanding to create, costly in material and labour, and burdensome to maintain in a wet maritime environment where iron threatens constantly to rust. The warrior wealthy enough to own mail carries a great advantage, but he also displays access to extraordinary resources. In the well-furnished grave at Gjermundbu in Norway, where the most famous surviving Viking Age helmet was found, fragments of a mail shirt were recovered alongside a collection of weapons and riding equipment. The grave does not reveal what every raider wore. It reveals almost the opposite equipment of this quality belongs to a man of exceptional standing, someone whose burial announces status as clearly as it records war. For the majority aboard a raiding vessel, protection may have been far less complete. Some could have shields and weapons but no metal armour at all. Some may have acquired helmets without mail. Some may carry inherited, repaired, traded or captured equipment whose histories vanish when objects leave no written account. A ship's crew is unlikely to resemble the clean uniformity of a modern unit. One man's spearhead may be freshly made, another's sword may be a prized possession. Another may trust to an axe and shield and the confidence that speed will matter more than prolonged fighting. Rank, loyalty and wealth shape what each person can bring. Successful violence can improve equipment, failed violence can deposit it in a field, a riverbed, a grave, or the possession of an enemy. What survives in the record suggests a world in which martial display matters deeply, but where full protective equipment is expensive enough to distinguish a small number of warriors from the many men whose survival depends on shield work, formation, timing, and luck. Then there is the helmet, the object upon which the entire later myth balances. Iron head protection makes immediate sense in a world of axes, swords, stones, and spears. The skull is unforgiving, and even a glancing strike can decide a life. Yet helmets are frustratingly rare in the archaeology of the Viking Age. Iron can corrode. Valuable objects may be reused rather than buried. Burial customs vary from region to region and through time. Not every warrior receives his fighting gear in the grave, and not every grave survives discovery intact. This scarcity means no honest reconstruction can claim that every Scandinavian fighter wore the same helmet. Some almost certainly fought bareheaded or with less durable protection now lost. Others, particularly the wealthy or professionally martial, possessed iron helmets designed to cover the most vulnerable parts of the head while preserving sight, hearing, and movement. The helmet from Gjermundbu, buried in Norway in the later 10th century, offers the clearest glimpse. It is not a smooth fantasy dome, nor a theatrical crown, but a carefully made iron helmet assembled from several plates joined by reinforcing bands. At the front sits a protective guard around the eyes and nose, giving the wearer a stern, mask-like appearance without requiring any imagined animal ornament. In its original condition, it may have been associated with additional protection for vulnerable areas, and it belonged to a burial rich enough to separate its owner immediately from an ordinary man caught in a sudden raid. Even damaged and incomplete after centuries in the ground, it has a severe power. Its menace comes from function. The narrow iron framing over the face makes the wearer look less exposed, less reachable, more prepared to enter the dangerous distance where one man can kill another. It does not need horns. Horns would contribute nothing to its central purpose, and might add obstacles in a press of shields, inside a ship, beneath branches, or wherever a weapon can glance, catch, or wrench. A second near-complete Viking Age helmet, recognised at Yarm in northern England, reinforces the picture of practical head protection rather than horned display. Other fragments and possible pieces hint that helmets existed in greater numbers than the tiny survival rate allows us to see. Even so, their rarity remains meaningful. A helmet is not the inevitable badge of every raider. It may signal an elite warrior, a leader, a retainer with substantial backing, or someone fortunate enough to obtain valuable gear through trade, gift, inheritance, or war. Later art has made helmets visually essential because it needs the audience to read warrior instantly. Real violence is less tidy. A man can be dangerous in a wool cap, terrifying behind a shield, lethal with a spear, and dead before he has ever possessed enough iron to cover his head. The equipment also changes with place and time. The Viking Age lasts generations, stretches across wide regions, and brings Scandinavians into contact with Anglo-Saxon England, the Carolingian world, the Baltic, the steppe routes, Ireland, Byzantium and the North Atlantic. Styles of blades, fittings, armour and mounted gear move through trade, service, plunder and imitation. Some Norse fighters serve foreign rulers, encounter other military traditions, and return with objects or ideas unavailable to an earlier coastal raider. A warrior associated with a royal force in the 11th century may not be equipped exactly like a small band attacking a monastery 2 centuries before. The desire to picture one universal Viking costume collapses all this variation into a single disguise. The past is more uneven one ship carrying men whose outward appearance records different fortunes, different journeys and different degrees of nearness to power. Even the most imposing armour cannot turn combat into certainty. Mail may stop a slash but leave ribs broken beneath the impact. A helmet may deflect one strike and fail against another. A shield may save a man repeatedly before splitting at precisely the wrong moment. Wet wool grows heavy. Footwear slips on rock, blood, mud or seaweed. A sword catches in wood. A spear snaps. A thrown stone from a defending wall finds an unprotected face. The people who go raiding know, without needing heroic poetry to tell them, that equipment increases chances rather than erases danger. This may be why weapons and armour can carry such emotional and ceremonial force. They are not props. They accompany risk, reward, injury, death, memory and burial. A prized sword placed beside a dead man, a shield laid over him, or a broken helmet deposited with his body speaks of a life understood through conflict and standing, even when the details of that life can no longer be recovered. Standing now on the beach where the ship has landed, the real warrior is vivid enough without later decoration. His cloak has been cast back or left aboard. Beneath it, his tunic shows the quality his resources allow. His legs are wrapped for movement over rough ground. His belt carries knife, pouch and fittings familiar to his own hand. A shield covers much of him from view. A spear extends his reach. Perhaps a sword hangs at his side, costly and admired. Perhaps an axe is all he needs. Among those with wealth and rank, iron mail shifts with a low metallic weight, and a practical helmet darkens the brow. No animal horns rise above the line of shields. Nothing on his body needs to turn him into a creature from legend. He is frightening because he is equipped according to a real world, a world in which protection is scarce, violence is close, and every useful piece of iron represents both human labour and the serious expectation that it may soon meet another weapon. The iron does not speak easily. It comes out of the earth swollen with corrosion, fused to soil, cracked by pressure, sometimes broken before anyone realises what has been found. A helmet is not discovered as a warrior last saw it, brightened by oil, fitted to the head, perhaps catching pale sunlight on the morning of departure. It arrives as a problem. Its plates may have collapsed inward. Rivets may be hidden beneath rust. Pieces may have been separated by ploughing, by grave robbery, by the careless strike of a spade, or simply by the slow destruction of time. The investigator has to ask what this damaged object once was, where it came from, whether it belongs to the burial around it, whether it is genuinely Viking Age, and whether later expectations are quietly shaping the answer. For the horned helmet, this is where the famous image should finally become solid. If Viking warriors commonly carried those unmistakable projections into war, some trace ought to emerge among the graves, weapons, helmet fragments, depictions and deposits left across their world. Instead, the search leads repeatedly back to practical iron, ambiguous images, and an absence too consistent to ignore. The most important helmet begins not in a royal saga or a battlefield chronicle but beneath a Norwegian farm landscape. At Gjermundbu, in the district of Ringerike northwest of Oslo, a burial mound revealed the broken equipment of a high-status warrior from the later Viking Age. The grave had not remained perfectly untouched. Its contents had suffered disturbance and decay. Yet from the damaged iron came an object of extraordinary importance. The remains of a helmet built from iron plates and reinforcing bands, with a guard protecting the eyes and nose. Alongside it were fragments of mail and an impressive collection of martial equipment. The burial does not resemble the resting place of an ordinary farmer called suddenly to defend a shoreline. It speaks of rank, horses, weapons, and the expensive identity of a man for whom warfare was central to status. If anyone in Viking Age Norway were likely to possess spectacular headgear, a richly equipped warrior such as this would be an obvious candidate. His helmet, however, has no horns. That simple fact carries more weight than 1,000 cheerful souvenir helmets. The yeoman we find does not prove that no individual in the entire Norse world ever placed horns on any kind of head covering for any purpose. Archaeology rarely grants such absolute declarations. A ritual performer, a ceremonial figure, a costumed participant in some event not captured in surviving evidence may have worn something extraordinary. Scholars still debate the interpretation of rare images and exceptional fragments, but the helmet recovered from a warrior burial, belonging to the kind of man later imagination most wants to transform into a horned raider, is designed for defense. Its brow and face guard give it presence, almost intimidation, without adding projections that would increase weight, catch blows, interfere with movement, or advertise an impractical taste for theatrical danger. For decades, Gjermundbu seemed almost painfully lonely, the only broadly complete Viking Age helmet available to show what such protection could look like. That loneliness helped create a curious imbalance. The public image contained endless horns, while the physical evidence depended heavily on a battered Norwegian object few people outside historical circles had seen. Then, a damaged iron helmet found much earlier in Yarm, near the River Tees in northern England, was re-examined with closer attention. It had been unearthed by workmen during the 1950s and remained a corroded, difficult object, not the kind that immediately reshapes popular history. Modern study identified it as a rare 10th century Anglo-Scandinavian helmet, a remarkable survival from a part of England deeply shaped by Scandinavian settlement and rule. Its construction again uses iron plates and bands, with protection around the eyes and nose. It, too, carries no horns. The arm helmet is important not because two objects are enough to reconstruct every helmet worn over several centuries and thousands of miles, but because it adds an independent witness. In Norway and in Anglo-Scandinavian England, the two most substantial Viking Age helmets yet recognised belong to a family of protective forms that are severe, practical and recognisably connected to earlier Northern European traditions of armoured headgear. They do not suggest that horn attachments have snapped away, leaving mysterious vacant sockets where the famous silhouette should have been. They do not require a curator to remove extravagant decorations in order to reveal a more restrained truth. They are simply helmets precious, uncommon, made for a world in which the person beneath them may soon be struck in the face. There are also smaller remains, less dramatic but valuable precisely because they do not depend on the survival of an entire helmet. In Denmark, a fragment from Tjele was long interpreted in another way before being recognised as part of a helmet, most likely a brow or face-protecting component from the Viking Age. Other possible helmet fragments from Scandinavian or Eastern contexts have been studied and debated, each carrying the usual difficulties of fragmentary iron incomplete context. Uncertain reconstruction, resemblance to other kinds of fittings, and the danger of building too much from too little. Yet these pieces, where accepted as helmet elements, again point toward iron defensive equipment rather than horns fixed to the skulls of common raiders. Had horns been widespread, archaeologists would not necessarily expect complete pairs gracefully preserved beside perfect helmets. They might expect fittings, bases, reinforced attachments, repeated iconographic confirmation. Specialised metal joins, or even unmistakable damage patterns, those signals do not gather into a persuasive Viking Age case. The grave record deepens the difficulty for the myth. Viking Age burials can be astonishingly rich. Some include swords, spearheads, axes, shields, riding equipment, boats, wagons, animals, household implements, jewellery, foreign goods, gaming pieces and objects whose ceremonial meaning can only be approached carefully. Death is a moment when communities display identity, wealth, lineage, memory and belief. Not every living possession is buried with the dead, of course. Valuable helmets may have passed to heirs or followers. A defeated warrior may lose his equipment before burial. Cremation damages objects. Christian burial increasingly changes what is placed in graves. Grave robbery removes desirable metal. The absence of horned helmets cannot be treated as though every warrior's wardrobe has been neatly inventoried beneath the soil. But grave archaeology has produced enough martial material to expose a basic contradiction. The object most modern viewers regard as the defining item of Viking war gear is not merely uncommon. In a convincing combat form, it is missing. The same is true of battle and settlement evidence. Weapons fall into rivers, are offered into wetlands, lost near fortifications, buried in hoards, discarded when broken, or carried far from their first owners. Fortresses and trading settlements yield metalwork connected to violence and daily life. Rivets from ships, arrowheads, spearheads, sword fragments and shield fittings survive in settings shaped by Viking movement and conflict. Iron head protection may be rare for all the reasons that make it valuable and recyclable, but a regular tradition of horn-mounted helmets would leave a recognisable trail somewhere across this broad material world. It does not. The evidence remains incomplete. yet incompleteness cannot explain an absence that repeats across so many kinds of site, while later popular imagery continues to present horns as nearly universal. Written sources provide little rescue. The contemporary victims of Scandinavian attacks could be vivid, horrified, and condemnatory. Monastic chroniclers describe devastation, slaughter, captivity, sacrilege, and fear. They view the raiders through religious and political alarm, sometimes framing their violence as punishment or catastrophe. If fleets of warriors had routinely arrived wearing monstrous horned helmets, the detail would have suited the chronicler's purpose almost perfectly. It would have made the pagan attackers visually strange, demonic, and memorable. Yet descriptions of raids do not provide secure testimony for the standard horned warrior helmet. Later, sagas and poems preserve invaluable traditions about Norse society, heroes, kings, conflict, and belief, but they were written down after the Viking Age, in Christianized societies looking back through memory and literature. They offer no reliable foundation for placing horns on ordinary battlefield helmets. Images appear to promise more, because a drawing, carving, or textile figure can show what prose leaves unnamed. Viking Age and nearby Scandinavian art includes human figures with weapons, helmets, headdresses, birds, animal associations, and scenes that may touch on ritual or myth. Some small figures and images have unusual forms rising from their heads. These are precisely the objects most likely to be lifted out of context and presented as proof that the famous helmet must have existed after all. But images do not identify themselves. A figure may represent a god, a ritual specialist, a dancer, a masked warrior, a legendary being, or a symbolic scene whose meaning was clear to the original audience and obscure to modern observers. A pair of projections may be horns, birds, stylized ornament, a ceremonial headdress, or part of a composition damaged by time. Even when an image genuinely shows horn-like headgear, it does not automatically describe what ship crews wear in battle. There is a telling difference between exceptional display and ordinary equipment. Human societies repeatedly place impractical things on heads during ceremonies, crowns, antlers, feathers, high caps, masks, animal skins, gilded forms, and sacred emblems that no sensible soldier would choose for a struggle at close quarters. Northern Europe is no exception. Horned headgear existed in other periods and contexts, and animal symbolism could be powerful. But the modern myth does something archaeology does not permit. It takes the strange, the ceremonial, the uncertain, and the much older, then spreads it across an entire class of Viking warriors until it looks normal. A rare ritual image becomes the costume of an invading fleet, a prehistoric object becomes a medieval helmet, an artistic convention becomes eyewitness equipment. At every step, possibility is enlarged into certainty. Even the act of reconstruction can reveal the strength of expectation. When modern museums, reenactors, illustrators, and filmmakers choose how to represent Viking warriors, they must make decisions from partial evidence. The careful reconstruction may appear visually understated iron cap, nose guard, shield, spear, woolen mail where status permits. To viewers raised on horned figures, the accurate version can look less Viking than the invented one. Archaeology is forced into the odd position of correcting an image that never needed ancient proof to become famous. Yeomanbu and Yarm sit silently behind glass or in scholarly publication, while the horned helmet strides confidently across the public imagination, untouched by the inconvenience that the best-preserved Viking Age helmets do not resemble it. Yet the silence of the evidence is not empty. It gives back something more interesting than a debunked costume. It gives back the real scale of rarity and value. A helmet is not a cheap comic marker worn by every man on every shore. It is worked iron, skilled labour, protection worth preserving and perhaps worth inheriting. Its loss in a grave is significant. Its recovery after 1,000 years is extraordinary. Its battered surface has been closer to a Viking Age warrior than any modern illustration ever can be. The face behind the Yeomanbu guard is gone. The man associated with the Yarm helmet cannot be named with certainty. But their equipment remains stubbornly human, built for pain, risk and survival rather than legend. By the time the iron has been cleaned, compared and set against the full landscape of finds, the famous horns have nowhere secure to stand. They do not rise from the rich warrior grave. They do not emerge from the rare, nearly complete helmet in England. They do not repeat through fragments, battlefield traces, or reliable written description. They flicker instead at the edges of symbolism and interpretation, in places where ritual. Memory and art may be doing something other than documenting normal war gear. That does not end the story. It opens the next door. For if Viking Age warriors did not leave behind the horned helmets that have made them instantly visible to the modern world, then the horns must have come from somewhere else, and beneath the Viking layer, much deeper in northern soil, lie helmets that truly do bear horns. Objects real enough to mislead history precisely because they belong to a world far older than the Vikings, who would eventually inherit their shadow. Far below the layer of Viking memory, below the ship burials and iron weapons and Christian chronicles that describe raiders striking the coasts of Europe, there is another north. It is a north of bronze rather than mail, of long-distance metal routes rather than silver hordes from Islamic lands, of sun symbols, sacred wetlands, rock carvings and ceremonies whose words have vanished completely. More than 15 centuries before the first recorded Viking attacks, people in Scandinavia already knew the image of the horned head. They carved it into stone, they shaped it in bronze. In one astonishing case, They placed actual horned helmets into a watery landscape where they remained until the modern world found them and, almost inevitably, tried to fit them onto the wrong men. The discovery comes in 1942 during the difficult years of German occupation in Denmark. At Bruns Mose, a peat bog near the village of Viksø on the island of Zealand, a worker cutting into the dark wet ground feels his spade strike something hard. Peat cutting is practical labour, not a carefully planned excavation, and the first response is not reverence but confusion. Bronze fragments appear where ordinary fuel should have been. When the pieces are examined and more of the deposit recovered, they resolve into something almost unreal: two nearly identical helmets, each crowned by great curved horns. They are not scraps of decoration from a modern costume. They are not 19th century stage objects lost in a field. They are prehistoric artefacts, elaborate, deliberate, and unmistakably horned. Seen today, the Viksø helmets possess exactly the dramatic power later imagination assigns to Viking warriors. Their bronze surfaces are decorated with raised bosses. Their fronts suggest enormous staring eyes. Curving elements evoke beaks, perhaps recalling powerful birds. Above each helmet rise long horns sweeping outward and upward, with an elegance that feels both animal and ceremonial. The objects appear less like ordinary protection than transformed faces human. Bird-like and bull-like qualities joined into a single shining image. In their original condition, they may have carried further ornaments, perhaps feathers or horsehair, attached along the crest or near the horn fittings, adding movement and colour when worn or displayed. Nothing about them feels designed for ordinary fighting in the press of shields. Everything about them seems designed to be seen. For many years, their age was understood generally through style and archaeological context. These were Bronze Age objects, not Viking equipment. More recent scientific work made the separation sharper still. Organic material preserved deep within one of the horns allowed radiocarbon dating, indicating that the helmets were deposited around the late Nordic Bronze Age, close to 900 BC. The Viking Age conventionally begins more than 16 centuries later. The men who raided Lindisfarne settled Iceland, served in Constantinople or fought over the English throne belonged to a world separated from the Viksø deposit by more time than separates many modern viewers from medieval castles. Whatever the horned helmets meant, they did not belong to Viking raiders setting out in longships. That distance matters because the human mind has a habit of folding ancient time together. Bronze Age Scandinavia, Iron Age Scandinavia, and Viking Age Scandinavia can collapse in popular memory into one generalised northern pass forests. Ships, weapons, pagan gods, firelight and helmets with horns. Yet the people who made or used the Viksø helmets lived in a very different society from the later Norse world. Bronze itself was a statement of connection and privilege. Copper and tin had to move across enormous distances through exchange networks reaching far beyond Denmark. Skilled craftspeople transformed costly metal into swords, razors, jewellery, shields, vessels, lures, ornaments, and ceremonial objects whose polished surfaces would have flashed with a golden brilliance before weathering into green and brown. To place two magnificent helmets into a bog was not to discard inconvenient equipment. It was to remove wealth from ordinary use in an act whose purpose was likely bound to ceremony, power, obligation, sacrifice, or communication with forces understood through ritual rather than through written theology. Wetlands repeatedly receive important objects in prehistoric northern Europe. Weapons, ornaments, tools, and sometimes human remains are placed in bogs, lakes, and marshy ground, landscapes that can seem neither fully land nor fully water. Such places may have been understood as boundaries dangerous, sacred, or appropriate for offerings meant to leave the human world. The Viksø helmets appear to have reached the end of their visible lives in such a setting. They were not abandoned on a battlefield with crushed skulls beneath them. They were carefully deposited in what was then a watery environment, perhaps after a ceremonial role had been completed, perhaps as part of an appeal, a display of authority, a response to crisis, or a ritual whose meaning no surviving record can restore. No single explanation fully accounts for why objects of such labour and value were surrendered to the bog. But ordinary military loss is among the least persuasive possibilities. The helmets are not isolated from a wider symbolic language. Bronze Age rock carvings in Scandinavia, especially in parts of western Sweden, show figures with horned headgear, sometimes associated with weapons, ships, axes, ritual postures or processions, carved into stone surfaces that may have looked toward water or caught shifting light. These images are difficult to interpret with precision. They do not arrive with labels announcing whether a figure is a ruler, priest, god, warrior, performer or ancestor. Yet they show that horned headgear was not merely an accidental flourish on two objects buried in a Danish bog. It belonged to a vocabulary of images familiar in parts of the Bronze Age North. Horns carried meaning. They may have expressed potency, sacred authority, martial identity, transformation, connection to animals, or participation in ceremonies where human appearance was deliberately altered. The surprise becomes greater when the view expands southward. Comparable horned imagery appears during the late Bronze Age in regions far from Scandinavia, including Sardinia and southwestern Iberia. Figures shown with horned helmets or horn-like headgear occur in settings connected with power, weaponry, and elite display. The similarities do not mean that one simple tribe or migrating army carried a standard horned uniform from the Mediterranean to Denmark. Ancient connections are rarely so tidy. But they do suggest that symbols, technologies, Metal and ideas could travel through networks stretching across Europe, linking communities separated by seas and landscapes, but not isolated from one another. Scandinavia in the Bronze Age is not a frozen margin waiting for history to begin with Viking ships. It is already participating in distant currents of exchange and imagery, receiving and reshaping symbols whose precise paths remain debated. In this world, horns may have spoken a language later centuries could recognize emotionally even when they no longer understood it culturally. Real animal horns announce strength, maturity, danger, and display. On cattle or wild bulls, they transform the head into a weapon and a sign. On a human being, whether in bronze, costume, or carved image, they could create an impression of more than human power, add eyes and beak-like elements, perhaps feathers catching air or firelight. And the wearer no longer appears merely as a person protected by metal. He becomes an image moving through ritual space, perhaps embodying authority, violence, divine association, or the boundary between ordinary society and the forces that sustain or threaten it. The helmet is not valuable because it makes him efficient in battle. It is valuable because it makes him unforgettable. That distinction is precisely what modern culture later loses. A ceremonial object is visually powerful because it is extraordinary. Put it on every fighter, and it becomes a uniform. The Vixu helmets are so compelling that they seem to validate the image people already expect. Surely, somewhere in the northern past, warriors did wear horns. And indeed, some people in prehistoric Scandinavia may have worn horned headgear in selected ceremonial or symbolic contexts. That is an entirely different statement from claiming that Viking raiders, more than a millennium and a half later, sailed into battle with horns attached to their helmets. The first claim is supported by spectacular Bronze Age evidence. The second remains unsupported by Viking Age military archaeology. There is a subtle irony in the way the helmet survived. Bronze objects deposited in a bog around 900 BC emerged in the 20th century into a Europe already deeply accustomed to imagining Vikings with horns. Had they been discovered before the 19th century reinvention of the Viking, they might have remained firmly what they are marvels of the Nordic Bronze Age, but after painters, illustrators, stage designers, and popular entertainment had made the horned Viking familiar, the prehistoric helmet seemed almost a step forward as confirmation. Here were genuine northern horns, beautiful and ancient. Chronology, the least glamorous part of the story, struggled against visual force. The helmets looked like what people wanted Viking helmets to look like, and for casual memory that resemblance could matter more than the 16th century standing between them and a Viking ship. Yet placing them correctly in time does not make them less mysterious, it makes them more so. The Viking Age provides sagas written later, chronicles from victims and neighbours, named kings, settlements, coins, ships, and traces of journeys across the Atlantic and into Eastern Europe. The people associated with Vixu left no written account explaining who carried the helmets, what ceremony required them, what the horns announced, or why both were finally lowered into dark water. Their society is reconstructed from burials, bronze work, settlement evidence, pollen, carvings, objects and landscapes altered beyond recognition. The helmets retain an almost deliberate silence. Their great eyes stare outward, but they do not tell us whom they were meant to confront: spectators, rival elites, worshippers, ancestors, gods, or the sun itself. The temptation is to solve that silence by borrowing the best-known northern story and forcing the helmets into it, but their true setting is stranger than the shortcut. Imagine them not on raiders rushing over a beach, but emerging in a ceremony near water in a world of polished bronze and fire. Their surface is bright, their horns extending the wearer's presence, perhaps with feathers lifting in the wind. Nearby, ships may exist not as the longships of the Viking Age, but as vessels already central to travel, exchange, and sacred imagery. Weapons may be raised, music sounded through bronze horns, offerings carried forward, sunlight reflected from metal before the objects pass out of human possession and into the wet ground. The details cannot be recovered with certainty. The evidence remains incomplete, but the scene belongs to a society with its own meanings, not to a costume department waiting for Vikings to arrive. The horned helmet, then, is real and unreal at the same time. Real as bronze, real as a ritual object lifted from Danish peat, real as a symbol carved into Scandinavian rock during an age when Northern Europe was tied into surprising networks of wealth and imagery. Unreal only when it is carried forward through the centuries and placed without evidence on the heads of Viking warriors. The horns did not begin as a joke, a cartoon, or a careless historical mistake. They began in a much deeper past. Surrounded by power and ceremony, that is why they have been so difficult to dismiss. The myth did not invent the visual force of horned headgear from nothing. It borrowed an ancient force, detached it from its own vanished world, and eventually gave it to men who never needed it. The bronze horns sink back into their bog, and the centuries close over them. Metal changes, settlements change, languages shift, burial customs alter, new powers gather, and the religious life of Northern Europe is repeatedly remade. Yet the human impulse behind such headgear does not vanish so neatly. People still use the body as a surface on which meaning can be displayed. A face can be hidden beneath a mask. A cloak can suggest wealth, grief, office, or transformation. An animal skin can make a man appear to borrow something from the creature whose fur he wears. A weapon can be more than a weapon when lifted in ceremony, placed in a grave, or carried by a figure understood to stand between ordinary people and dangerous powers. By the Viking Age, horned helmets are no longer waiting in warrior burials to confirm the modern stereotype, but strange headgear and animal imagery have not disappeared from the northern imagination. They survive at the margins of evidence, flickering in small objects and difficult scenes, where the line between warrior, ritual performer, divine figure and story is rarely clean. To enter this world, it helps to release the modern expectation that religion must resemble a written creed with official explanations. Pre-Christian Norse belief is not preserved in a single contemporary handbook. It exists in traces place names that preserve divine associations, amulets shaped like Thor's hammer, burials organised around memory and status, sacrificed objects and animals, later poems carrying older material, medieval prose recorded after conversion, carved stones, pendants, tapestries, tiny metal figures and the uneasy testimony of outsiders. These traces reveal a sacred landscape crowded with relationships and risks, but they rarely explain themselves in full. A god may be honoured differently in different places. A ritual act may be practical, political and religious at the same time. An object that modern observers call symbolic may once have been understood as active, dangerous or protective. Scholars still debate how particular ceremonies worked and how widely specific beliefs were shared, because much of the lived religion of the Viking world disappeared before anyone attempted to record it systematically. The gods known from later Norse literature are not distant ornaments to the human world. They embody forces that press directly upon survival and power. Thor's hammer answers a need for defence and order in a world vulnerable to storm, illness, hunger, enemies and supernatural threat. Freyr is associated with fertility, peace and abundance, but abundance itself is political in a society where good seasons fill halls, support followers, and make generosity possible. Freya belongs to desire, wealth, death, and forms of magic whose implications later writers preserve only imperfectly. Odin is more unsettling a god of poetry and knowledge, but also of the slain, of rulers, sacrifice, sorcery, deception, and the volatile granting or withholding of victory. He's often associated with animals, especially ravens and wolves, creatures that gather around death or seem to carry an intelligence beyond ordinary human use. To enter battle beneath Odin's attention is not necessarily to expect safety. It may be to accept a relationship with a god whose gifts and demands are inseparable from danger. Animal association runs deeply through the elite and martial imagery of the Viking Age. A warrior may be praised through comparison with a beast. A helmet plate from an earlier Scandinavian period may show men connected to boars, birds or predatory forms. Swords, shields and brooches carry interlaced animals whose bodies knot into patterns difficult to separate from ornament itself. Ship prows may be fashioned with threatening heads, not because carved creatures literally drive the vessel, but because the vessel belongs in a world where appearance, fear, identity and protection overlap. Later sources describe Berserkir and Ulfhednar, warriors associated with bears and wolves, sometimes imagined as fighting with unnatural fury or wearing animal skins. How closely those descriptions reflect Viking Age military practice remains debated. Some may preserve real warrior traditions, some may be amplified by literature, and some may mix ritual identity with storytelling. What matters here is not whether every later description can be accepted literally, but that transformation through animal power was meaningful enough to endure in memory. Horns fit naturally into such a language of transformation, but not naturally into every battlefield. When a human figure wears horns, antlers, a bird-like crest or a mask, the result does more than protect the skull. It alters the person's category. He is still human, yet visually entangled with animal force or otherworldly authority. In many cultures, ritual dress does exactly this. A ceremony may require an individual to cease appearing ordinary for a time to become a god's attendant. An ancestor, a spirit, an enemy, a ruler magnified beyond his daily body, or a performer through whom a community approaches what it fears and reveres. Northern Europe offers tantalizing evidence for such transformed figures, though the evidence is often so compressed and stylized that any interpretation must remain careful. A small pendant may preserve a whole vanished ceremony in a form smaller than a hand, leaving modern observers staring at shapes whose original audience would have understood immediately. One of the most discussed images comes from Uppland in Sweden, where a small Viking Age bronze figure appears to show a standing person wearing an elaborate headpiece. From the head rise two projections that curve outward. Each seems to terminate in a bird's head or bird-like form. The figure may carry or display objects, and its posture has drawn comparisons with other images linked to Odin, ritual or dance. It is sometimes invoked as evidence that Viking Age Scandinavians knew horned headgear. In a limited sense, it may indeed show a ceremonial or symbolic headpiece with horn-like extensions, but the details matter. These are not simply the large bovine horns of the familiar cartoon Viking, fixed to a practical combat helmet, so that an ordinary raider can be recognised from across the sea. The projections appear entangled with bird symbolism, and the entire figure has a special, almost performative quality. Its significance may lie precisely in being exceptional. A similar puzzle appears on a small metal die from Torslanda, on the Swedish island of Öland, dating not from the Viking Age proper but from the earlier Vendel period, the centuries immediately preceding it. The die, intended for producing decorated metal foils, shows a remarkable scene: a warrior in a helmet, apparently wearing animal skins or associated with a beast. Faces or follows a one-eyed figure engaged in a dance or ritual movement. with spear in hand and an extraordinary horned or bird-headed headdress rising from his head. The damaged eye of the figure has led many scholars to connect him with Odin, though certainty remains elusive. The scene may relate to ritual dance, warrior initiation, mythic performance, or elite ideology. Whatever it depicts, it is one of the most powerful indications that extravagant headgear existed within a religious and martial symbolic world around the threshold of the Viking Age. It's also one of the worst possible pieces of evidence for claiming that the average Sea Raider wore horns in combat. A divine or ritual figure is not a uniformed infantryman. The same distinction appears in textile imagery. The Osberg ship burial in Norway, dating to the early 9th century, preserved extraordinary organic material because of the conditions of the grave-carved wooden objects, textiles, vehicles, household goods and traces of a burial ceremony among the richest ever recovered from the Viking Age. Among the textile fragments is imagery that includes processions, wagons, horses and human figures, some difficult to reconstruct because the woven cloth survives only in damaged pieces. One figure has sometimes been described as wearing horned headgear. The image invites fascination, partly because the burial itself belongs to an elite female setting filled with ritual possibilities, but the textile is not a clear report from a battlefield. If a horned or unusually adorned figure truly appears there, it may belong to ceremony, story, divine imagery or procession. The Osberg material proves that Viking Age ceremonial life could be visually complex and magnificent. It does not supply the missing horned war helmet. There are also small figures from Denmark and elsewhere that appear seated, masked, hooded, helmeted, animal-associated or otherwise difficult to classify. A tiny silver figure from Lasia in Denmark, for example, sits on a throne-like seat flanked by birds, often interpreted as Odin because of the raven association, though some scholars have argued the figure could be female or could represent another identity. This uncertainty is not a weakness in scholarship. It is an honest recognition that visual signals do not always translate cleanly across 1,000 years. A person in the Viking Age may have understood sex, status, divine presence, costume and authority in such an object once. While a modern label forces a single choice, the same caution applies to horns. A headpiece can mean many things before it means what all Viking warriors wore. Ritual performance may have been especially important in societies where memory is carried through acts as much as through written texts. A gathering in a hall, a burial procession, a seasonal sacrifice, a royal inauguration, a dramatic recitation of myth, or a warrior ceremony before departure could involve clothing and objects absent from everyday life. The sound of weapons against shields, the movement of dancers, the presence of animals, the smell of smoke and blood, the gleam of imported metal, and the elevation of a figure in extraordinary headgear may have created an experience of power understood by everyone present. Such events leave only broken traces. A decorated plaque survives without its performance. A textile survives without its song. A pendant survives without the person who wore it, or the story attached to it. Archaeology catches the props after the stage has vanished, and then must resist the temptation to imagine the entire society permanently dressed for its most dramatic ceremony. There is one further complication. Ritual objects and battlefield identities need not be entirely separate. Elite warriors may draw on sacred imagery in their equipment. A leader might wish to appear under divine favour. A warband might cultivate associations with animals, frenzy, fate, or a particular god. A helmet can protect the head while its ornament communicates rank or belief. Earlier Scandinavian helmets, especially from the centuries before the Viking Age, sometimes show more elaborate decoration than the scarce later Viking Age survivals. But practical war gear and ceremonial display exist on a spectrum, not in two sealed boxes. A warrior might wear a decorated helmet for display and a simpler one for actual fighting, or carry ritual associations into violence without fastening giant horns to his battle gear. The evidence permits complexity. It does not justify the easy modern picture in which every axe-bearing Norseman becomes a horn-crowned emblem of pagan ferocity. Indeed, if horns were connected with ritual power, their later popular use has flattened what once made them important. In the ancient and early medieval North, extraordinary headgear would have set an individual apart. It might identify the person closest to a god, a mythic role, a ceremony, a ruling claim, or a dangerous kind of warrior presence. In cartoons and costumes, horns identify everyone equally. The sacred sign becomes a costume shortcut. The rare transformed body becomes the standard tourist Viking. Something mysterious survives, but its meaning is reversed. What was perhaps once a marker of exceptional function becomes an inaccurate marker of an entire people. The scene on the shore can now be widened. Behind the raiding ship stands a society whose ordinary warriors do not need horns. Behind that society, however, lies a ritual imagination in which animals, gods, masks, birds, altered bodies, and exceptional headgear may carry immense force. On certain objects, a figure rises with projections from his head, perhaps bird-ended, perhaps horn-like, perhaps belonging to the shifting presence of Odin or to ceremonies now lost. He is not proof of a battlefield uniform. He is a reminder that myths rarely grow from pure emptiness. They seize a real but unusual sign, detach it from its difficult context, and repeat it until it becomes easier to recognize than the truth. The horns therefore hover at the threshold of the Viking Age, not as normal equipment but as possibility, symbol and misreading. They belong in the uncertain light of ritual, in the movement of a dancing figure stamped on metal, in the fragmentary weave of a burial textile, in the relationship between human warriors and the gods or beasts whose power they hope to approach. The modern Viking helmet has taken those scattered, mysterious traces and made them loudly ordinary. But before that could happen, the Viking himself had to survive the end of his own age and enter the hands of writers who saw northern pagans not as archaeologists see them now, but as enemies, ancestors, sinners, heroes, and raw material for story. After ritual shadows and ancient bronze have made the horns imaginable, another kind of witness waits in the surviving world of the Vikings themselves. It is not a rusted helmet lifted from a grave, but the art people made while ships still crossed northern waters under sail images hammered into small sheets of metal, cut into memorial stones, woven into costly textiles, stamped on coins, carved onto wood, cast as pendants, and scratched into objects whose makers never expected strangers 1,000 years later to study every line. Here, at first, the horned Viking seems as though he might finally step forward. A figure with a strange crest raises a weapon. A mounted traveller wears something pointed. A face peers from tangled ornament. A ship crowded with men moves beneath an image whose details have been weathered almost away. But the closer these witnesses are approached, the less comfortably they serve the familiar myth. Viking art is full of warriors, ships, weapons, and supernatural suggestion. What it does not give is a clear, repeated parade of ordinary raiders wearing horned helmets as standard gear. This is partly because Viking Age art was not created as a modern documentary archive. It was not attempting to provide a neutral catalogue of clothing for future historians. Its purposes were immediate and often charged with status, grief, belief, and memory. A carved stone raised beside a road or near a farm could commemorate a dead relative, proclaim inheritance, declare religious allegiance, record a journey, or set a family's standing into the landscape. A metal brooch or pendant travelled on the body, catching light and signalling taste, connection, and perhaps protection. A woven wall hanging could surround an elite burial or hall, with images meaningful to people who already knew the story. Artists compressed bodies, ships and animals into tight spaces, stylized what viewers were expected to recognize, enlarged important features, and left out ordinary details. A weapon may be shown because it identifies a role. A head may be given an extraordinary form because the figure is not ordinary. To read these images as if each were a battlefield photograph is to demand from them something they were never made to provide. Among the most haunting visual records are the picture stones of Gotland, the great island in the Baltic Sea, set among roots of travel and memory. Many stones belong to periods overlapping with or close to the Viking Age. The carved surfaces show ships with high stems and rows of crew, mounted riders, women offering drinking vessels, armed figures, scenes that have often been linked to death, heroic story, arrival in another world, or the public commemoration of those who travelled far. The stone images are worn, sometimes faint, their original colour largely gone, yet the ships remain unmistakable long hulls, swelling sails, ordered rows of men carried through a world where voyaging is inseparable from identity. When heads can be made out, they do not resolve into a fleet of unmistakably horned helmets. Their power lies in the ship, the journey, the rider, the welcome, the weapon, and the boundary between departure and return. Runestones add a quieter witness. Across Scandinavia, inscriptions name men who die abroad or travel east and west, preserving identity through kin, destination, and reputation. Some stones include ships or armed figures, yet they do not establish horns as the signature of the voyaging warrior. Had horned battle helmets been the proud, recognisable badge modern culture imagines, their absence from the broad visual grammar of commemoration would be difficult to explain. The surviving textiles from Osberg pull the viewer into a far more difficult realm. Buried within the magnificent Norwegian ship grave in the early 9th century, the tapestries survive only in fragments, discoloured and damaged, yet crowded with hints of motion. Horses proceed with wagons, human figures appear in lines or groups, objects are carried, bodies seem engaged in an ordered event whose exact nature remains elusive. It may reflect ceremonial procession, funeral imagery, myth. Remembered performance or more than one of these at once. Some figures appear armed. One has been interpreted as carrying unusual headgear, perhaps horned or otherwise elevated above the ordinary human outline. That single possibility has great attraction because the textile comes from the Viking Age itself and from one of its richest ritual contexts. But that context is also the warning. Oseberg is not an illustration of an average raid. It is an elite burial, filled with objects selected for death, display, memory, and meanings still fiercely discussed. A remarkable figure in a ceremonial textile cannot establish the normal costume of fighting men. If anything, it suggests how strongly exceptional imagery belonged to special occasions. Tiny objects make the problem sharper because they invite enlargement beyond their certainty. Pendants and amulets can preserve a human form only a few centimetres high. A head may be topped by a cap, a helmet, hair, a headdress, horns, birds, or decorative abstraction, and centuries of wear can turn differences once obvious into disputes. The bronze figure from Upland, with its apparent horn-like extensions ending in bird-shaped forms, is one of the most provocative. In outline, it is nearly everything a viewer seeking a Viking horned helmet hopes to find a Viking-age human figure, a headpiece and upward curving projections. Yet what it resembles is not a practical warrior outfitted for a beach assault. Its headgear is elaborate, symbolic and possibly tied to a figure performing a special role. The birds point away from simple military equipment and toward a religious or legendary language that might have been associated with Odin, transformation. Elite display or ritual movement? What survives in the record suggests not that the horns are fake, but that their meaning is far stranger than the modern costume permits. Earlier imagery, such as the famous Torslunda die from Ueland, reinforces that distinction. Although it belongs to the Vendel period before the Viking Age, it sits close enough to the later world to illuminate inherited martial and sacred imagery. On the little die, a figure in remarkable headgear stands near a warrior associated with an animal form. The head projections have often been described as horns, but their ends appear bird-like, creating an image that is not merely animal but composite. If this figure relates to Odin, ritual dance, or warrior initiation, then it carries a dimension invisible in the plastic helmets sold to tourists. It is about entering a charged identity, not dressing every fighter according to one historical fashion. It may show that certain northern elites recognised horned or bird-crowned imagery as potent. It does not show that raiders clustered behind their shields with projections catching on rigging and branches as they fought. Weapons in art offer a useful contrast. Spears, swords, axes and shields appear again and again because they are genuinely central to warrior identity and heroic representation. Their forms may be stylised, their proportions manipulated, but their repetition corresponds with the archaeological record. Ships appear repeatedly because voyages matter, and ships are physically recovered from the same culture. Horses, halls, drinking vessels. Birds and beasts all recur within images whose themes have parallels in burial, poetry, or social practice. A standard horned battle helmet does not enjoy this convergence. It appears only when uncertain or exceptional headgear is interpreted as horns, usually on figures whose context is already unusual. If an object is as ordinary and defining as modern popular culture implies, it should not require the viewer to build a case from a few symbolic exceptions. Even a simple helmet can be difficult to identify in carved or woven images. Iron head protection seen from a distance may appear as a rounded cap, a peaked form, a nose guard, or merely a line above the face. Artistic convention can exaggerate a point or reduce a complex helmet to its most legible shape. A carving damaged by centuries of rain may lose the difference between a head and a hat. In some Viking Age images, armed figures wear head coverings that seem conical or rounded, consistent with the practical forms indicated by rare helmet archaeology and by neighbouring traditions. Yet caution applies even here. Not every pointed head is a helmet. Not every armed figure is a direct portrayal of equipment observed in life. The strength of the practical helmet interpretation comes not from one ambiguous image, but from its agreement with actual defensive logic and the surviving iron examples, horns, by contrast, require an extraordinary claim to rest almost entirely on extraordinary images. There is another absence that is easy to overlook mockery. Enemies of Scandinavian raiders had strong reason to make them look strange, savage and pagan. Christian artists and writers did not always hesitate to mark threatening outsiders with visual difference. Yet contemporary and near-contemporary representations connected with northern warfare do not confidently fix horns on the Viking enemy. Where later medieval art depicts warriors descended from Scandinavian conquerors, or fighting in a world shaped by Viking expansion, the recognisable martial helmet is usually practical conical, nasal guarded, fitted for combat. The Bayeux tapestry belongs after the conventional Viking age and tells the story of Norman conquest, rather than a raid from Norway or Denmark, but its warriors are heirs to a martial culture with Scandinavian roots. They cross the sea, land horses, carry shields, wield spears and axes, and fight with brutal intensity. The helmets produce the familiar guarded faces of actual medieval warfare. They do not need horns to appear dangerous. Normans in 1066 are not interchangeable with 9th century raiders, and one embroidery cannot dictate earlier equipment. Yet a conical helmet with a nose guard above a mail-clad fighter loses nothing in ferocity. Horns do not make battle more real, they make it easier to turn battle into emblem. The surviving Viking images therefore occupy an uneasy place in the story. They neither offer the clean simplicity of a modern correction nor surrender entirely to the myth. It would be too easy to say there are no horn-like forms anywhere in the visual world of the Viking Age. There are images that demand attention, figures whose headgear may include horns, birds, or some combination of the two. There are rituals, myths, and warrior identities whose full meanings are beyond recovery. The evidence remains incomplete, and a responsible reading leaves space for unusual headdresses worn by exceptional people in exceptional settings. But the central distinction does not waver. The images that might contain horns are rare, symbolic and difficult. The images that show travel, warfare, remembrance and status do not establish horned helmets as ordinary martial equipment. Perhaps this is why the later myth proves so resilient. It can point to a real image without accepting its limits. It can take the Oseberg fragment, the Upland figure, the Torslunda die, or the far older Vixu helmets, and say that horns were present somewhere in the northern past. That part is not entirely wrong. Then, almost without notice, it changes the question. It stops asking what a rare horned figure meant and begins imagining what every Viking looked like. A ritual sign is recruited as a uniform, a mysterious artifact is pressed into service as an illustration. The gap between symbol and soldier disappears. On the stone shore, beneath a carved sail, the Viking warrior remains more elusive and more believable. He is remembered with shield and spear, aboard a ship, on horseback, approaching a woman with a cup, entering a story of voyage, death, or honour. Near him, perhaps, stands another figure whose head rises into strange shapes, a being or performer touched by the sacred drama of his world, the two do not have to be the same person. Viking art never asks them to be. Only much later will audiences gaze back into these broken images, gather the rarest forms together, and demand that an entire northern age wear the most dramatic silhouette they can find. The carved warrior fades into weathered stone, and in his place another Viking begins to form, not in bronze or iron, but in ink. This figure enters history through the eyes of people who often meet him at the worst possible moment, when sails appear offshore without warning, when a monastery door is broken open, when bells sound alarm, when bodies lie beside sacred buildings, when captives are taken away towards ships already pushing from the strand. To those who record such events, the raiders are not interesting foreign traders with complicated households and elegant combs. They are a wound in the world. They arrive from beyond familiar order, strike at places protected by prayer and custom, then vanish over water before justice can answer them. If the material remains of the Viking age give a stubbornly practical warrior, the written remains often give something more terrible, an enemy shaped by shock, religion, grief, and memory. On the coast of Northumbria in 793, the attack on Lindisfarne enters the record beneath an atmosphere of dread. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle associates the year with terrifying signs before the assault storms, flashes in the sky, and fiery dragons seen in the air, followed by famine and then the devastation of the Holy Island by heathen men. Such portents are not a neutral weather report. They belong to a Christian understanding of catastrophe in which disaster is rarely meaningless. A holy community has been attacked, and the event demands an explanation larger than armed men seeking portable wealth. To those who hear of it or survive its consequences, the raid seems to reveal a world out of balance. The sea has not merely brought thieves, it has delivered judgment, terror, and the humiliating proof that even a sacred refuge can be reached by violence. The scholar Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne after hearing of Lindisfarne, responds with anguish. He had grown up in Northumbria and knew what the monastery represented. His letters ask how such horror could have happened at a place connected with saints and learning, and he urges moral reform, interpreting the attack through the conviction that sin may invite punishment. The raiders in his response are frightening, partly because they fit into a larger spiritual drama. Yet even here, where a writer has every reason to emphasise their alien and pagan character, the fear is not built around horned helmets. It is built around desecration, bloodshed, captivity, and the collapse of confidence. In one often discussed passage written shortly before the Lindisfarne disaster, Alcuin criticises Northumbrian elites for copying the hair and dress of pagans. The detail is startling. The Scandinavian appearance that troubled him may have been fashionable enough to imitate. The hated outsider could also be admired, envied, or visually borrowed from, a much more uncomfortable truth than a simple picture of monsters descending from darkness. As raids multiply, chroniclers give them different names according to language and perspective. In England, they may be Danes or heathens. In Frankish sources, they are frequently Northmen. Irish annals distinguish groups at times as dark foreigners and fair foreigners, terms whose exact implications scholars still debate. To Muslim writers describing attacks on Iberian shores, the raiders can appear under names associated with pagan outsiders. A label later readers have sometimes translated too simply as fire worshippers. The terms are not meaningless, but neither are they modern ethnic passports. They show communities trying to classify strangers whose ships arrive from directions already loaded with fear, a warrior from Norway fighting an island, a Danish fleet on the Seine, Scandinavian settlers in England. Or raiders striking Al-Andalus can all be drawn into broad categories shaped as much by the needs of the observer as by how those men would have named themselves. The Frankish world knows the same shock in escalating form. During the 9th century, Scandinavian fleets navigate rivers that seem to offer a road directly into the wealth of kingdoms. They attack monasteries and towns, threaten centres of power, extract payments and exploit political division among rulers who are already struggling with one another. Paris is attacked more than once. In 845, a Viking force moves up the Seine and obtains a vast payment after threatening the city. Later, in the long siege of 885 to 886, Scandinavian attackers confront a city better defended and determined to resist. Accounts of such events make the Northmen into relentless forces of pressure, their ships returning like a season no prayer can permanently prevent. The chroniclers do not need to invent their destructiveness. River raids, tribute and burned settlements supply enough material, but the repeated telling gradually gives the enemy a scale beyond the individual men involved. The Northmen become nearly a natural disaster, a tide advancing inland. Irish writings preserve a world in which Scandinavian violence is severe, but Scandinavian presence soon becomes entangled with local politics. Monasteries and settlements are attacked, captives taken, ships gather on rivers and coasts. Then fortified bases grow, trading centres develop, and Norse leaders become participants in rivalries involving Irish kings and other Norse factions. Dublin becomes not merely the memory of a raid, but an important Scandinavian-connected town, a harbour of trade. Power and human trafficking. Annals may record battles, killings and changes of control in compact lines, whose brevity hides entire lives. Later Irish literary traditions can portray Vikings with dramatic hostility, emphasising foreign brutality and heroic resistance. Yet the reality beneath the stories includes alliance, intermarriage, trade and political calculation. The terrifying outsider gradually becomes a neighbour, rival, ruler, customer, employer, enemy and sometimes kin. Fear remains fear. But it can no longer keep the boundary simple. Far to the south, the ships appear where a popular northern image rarely places them. In 844, Scandinavian raiders enter the Iberian world, striking parts of the coast and attacking Seville before forces of the Emirate of Cordoba defeat them. For an audience accustomed to imagining the Viking age only through fog, cliffs, English monasteries and cold northern rivers, the scene is jarring longships moving through warmer waters toward a major city in Islamic Spain. Confronting a sophisticated state with cavalry, administrative resources and its own military traditions, writers in the Islamic world preserve accounts of these northern attackers in ways shaped by their own categories and concerns. Again, no horns are required. The strange fact is the voyage itself, the breadth of the world within reach of Scandinavian ships, and the ability of an enemy from the far north to erupt into places far beyond the familiar theatre of Viking legend. Such sources are invaluable because they place Scandinavians into dated events and real landscapes. They reveal routes, attacks, settlements, leaders, political responses, and the emotional impact of sudden violence. But they also shape memory unevenly. A monastery that is raided may produce writers who record the attack. A quiet exchange of goods on another coast may leave no narrative at all. A violent arrival becomes visible because violence demands remembrance. A peaceful season in which northern traders acquire cloth, metal, wine, or information may disappear unless an object survives in the soil. This imbalance does not mean the raids were exaggerated out of existence. The violence was real, and for its victims central. It does mean that written history naturally magnifies some forms of encounter over others. The Viking seen through chronicles is frequently the Viking, at the instant he is least welcome and most destructive. Christian writers also view pagan religion through a frame that can turn difference into moral threat. A raider who attacks a monastery is not merely a foreign soldier stealing wealth, he is a heathen violating a sacred order. Idols, sacrifices, strange rites and rejection of Christian truth could make Scandinavians appear spiritually dangerous in addition to physically violent. This atmosphere later makes it easy to imagine visual signs of savagery. Even though contemporary chroniclers do not supply the horned battlefield image, the pagan enemy is already symbolically outside the walls of civilization. Later artists will only need to give that outsiderness a visible crown. Yet the earliest descriptions tend to fear what Norse people do, not the theatrical shape of their helmets. Their ships, speed and actions provide sufficient evidence of danger. Within Scandinavia and its Atlantic settlements, the passage from lived event to remembered story takes another form. Much of what modern audiences think they know about Viking heroes, feuds, voyages and beliefs comes not from notes written during a raid, but from poems and prose preserved to generations later, particularly in Iceland. Iceland is settled during the Viking Age by people largely from Norway and the Norse world of the British Isles. There, in a society proud of ancestry, lore, storytelling and complex networks of family memory, histories of earlier generations remain important. By the 12th and 13th centuries, after Iceland has become Christian and writing in manuscripts has taken hold, authors record sagas about settlers, kings, poets, outlaws, feuds, voyages and legendary ages. These works are among the great literary achievements of medieval Europe. There are also not transparent windows open directly onto the 9th century. A saga may preserve genuine names, locations, family relationships, social expectations, legal customs, fragments of older poetry and memories rooted in real events. It may also compress generations, sharpen characters, organize accidents into meaningful plots and reshape the pagan past for Christian readers living centuries later. A hero's courage may be enlarged, a king's destiny may be clarified after the fact, a feud may become more symmetrical, more memorable, more morally charged than life ever permits. Supernatural dreams and omens may express what later storytellers believe a great event ought to have meant. Scholars still debate how much individual saga material reaches back accurately to oral tradition, and how much belongs to the literary craft of the medieval authors who gave it lasting form. The answer differs from one work and one detail to another. These stories contain history, but history braided with art. The poets offer an older and sometimes harder thread. Skaldic verse, composed for rulers and elites, can preserve praise of battles, voyages and gift-giving from close to the time of the events described. Its intricate structure and demanding language may help lines survive with remarkable durability, because alteration risks damaging the poetry itself. Yet Skaldic verse is not simple reportage either. A poet praising a ruler has reason to magnify victory, enemies and generosity. Metaphor folds ships into sea beasts, battle into storms, blood into imagery that demands learned interpretation. The warrior world appears in flashes of shield, raven, sword, wave and slaughter, dense with honour and violence. Here again, the raider is made memorable through the intensity of his deeds and the network of symbols surrounding war. His helmet need not grow horns for poetry to lift him beyond ordinary life. Over time, these written traditions do something the buried helmet never could. They provide personalities. Archaeology may show that a wealthy man was buried with weapons, but a saga gives men names, motives, grudges, pride, wit, and doom. Chronicles may report the arrival of a fleet, but later narratives turn voyages into the actions of ambitious kings and dangerous adventurers. The Vikings stop being merely scattered human remains and metal objects. They become characters. That transformation is necessary for cultural memory. People do not carry a corrosion diagram in their imagination as easily as they carry the story of a fearless raider, a clever explorer, a doomed outlaw, or a ruler who crosses the sea for a crown. But characters invite costumes, and costumes invite simplification. Once the northern warrior becomes a dramatic figure moving through tale and legend, it becomes possible for later centuries to dress him according to what feels right, rather than what the earth has preserved. Still, the medieval writers themselves have not yet placed the familiar horns securely on his brow. They provide the storm around him, the pagan terror seen by monks, the sea king magnified in poetry, the adventurer and feud maker of saga memory, the foreigner capable of crossing worlds and disrupting settled order. They preserve real violence and real journeys, but also an atmosphere in which the Viking seems larger, darker and more charged than an ordinary armed man. He enters memory already prepared for transformation. The iron helmet from the grave is quiet, defensive and rare. The Viking of words is restless, fated, heathen, royal, treacherous, brave or monstrous according to who is telling the tale. He has not yet been given horns, but the stage around him is being built a northern past filled with dangerous grandeur, waiting for later artists to decide what such a man ought to look like. The Viking who survives in medieval ink does not remain safely inside monasteries, sagas and old manuscript chests. Centuries pass in which the people of northern Europe live among ruins, burial mounds, place names and inherited stories without yet turning the Viking Age into the powerful public image it will later become. Then, as Europe moves through the 18th century and into the 19th, the distant north begins to attract a new kind of attention. Scholars search for origins, poets search for grandeur, painters search for subjects filled with storm, death and nobility. Nations, or communities beginning to imagine themselves as nations, search for ancestors strong enough to stand behind modern ambitions. In that gathering hunger for a usable past, the Norse world emerges from manuscript pages and buried objects transformed. The Viking is no longer merely the terror remembered by monks or the complicated protagonist of an Icelandic family saga. He becomes a cultural ancestor, a heroic type, an emblem of freedom and strength, a figure who seems capable of carrying the weight of modern identity on his shoulders. This rediscovery does not begin with fraud or simple ignorance. It begins with genuine fascination and real intellectual labour. Early modern scholars had long collected and interpreted northern antiquities, copied inscriptions, studied runes, compared languages and attempted to understand the old histories of Denmark, Sweden, Norway and Iceland. Icelandic manuscripts proved especially important because they preserved narratives and poetry connected with pre-Christian myth, kings, voyages and settlement, the medieval works associated with Snorri Sturluson, the poems gathered under the name of the poetic Edda, and the many sagas supplied a northern literary inheritance of astonishing richness. For readers accustomed to looking toward Greece and Rome for heroic antiquity, the discovery that the North possessed its own gods, warriors, tragedies, voyages and poetic language could feel electrifying. Odin, Thor, Freya, Sigurd, Brynhild, kings, skalds. Feud makers and sea travellers began to move into the consciousness of readers who wanted the ancient North not as a dark margin of civilization, but as a source of beauty and seriousness in its own right. Yet every rediscovery is shaped by the desires of the people doing the rediscovering. The scholars who handled old texts sought accuracy, but the wider culture that absorbed their work lived in an age increasingly suspicious of cold reason and hungry for emotion, wilderness, origin and national character. Romanticism turned attention toward mountains, ruins, storms, folk tradition, heroic loss, and landscapes imagined as untouched by modern weakness. The North offered all of this in abundance. Its surviving stories spoke of winter seas, doomed loyalties, feuds carried across generations, rulers tested by exile and battle, gods awaiting destruction, and explorers who pushed beyond familiar shores. In paintings and poems, the Viking could be made to stand upon a cliff against the wind, his ship below him, and his gaze fixed on some dangerous horizon. He became a man of elemental freedom, closer to nature, closer to war. Closer to origins than the crowded citizens of industrializing Europe imagined themselves to be. The transformation is especially powerful in Scandinavia, where the past is not merely exotic material but ancestral ground. During the centuries after the Viking Age, Denmark, Sweden and Norway had followed separate and entangled political histories, marked by unions, rivalries, losses of territory, shifting power and, in Norway's case, long periods under Danish rule before the 19th century struggle for political identity. The Viking past provided something both shared and competitive. A northern age before present limitations, filled with kings, expeditions, settlements, assemblies and ships reaching outward across the world. To claim closeness to that past was to claim antiquity, vitality and dignity. Even when writers celebrated a broadly Scandinavian inheritance, their work could serve the emotional needs of more particular national communities. The Viking became not simply a historical person, but an answer to an anxious modern question: what kind of people are we? And what greatness might already be buried in our beginnings? In Denmark, the poet Adam Oehlenschläger helped awaken a romantic passion for Old Norse myth and heroic antiquity. His work drew upon northern legend not as dry material for antiquarians, but as living drama, filled with emotional force and cultural belonging as in Sweden. Erik Gustaf Geyer wrote about the Viking as a heroic figure of independence, movement and daring, helping shape an image in which the sea-roving northern warrior embodied restless freedom. The Viking in this new literature could be harsh, but his harshness was increasingly admired rather than simply condemned. He was not the heathen scourge seen from a burned monastery. He was the bold adventurer refusing confinement, the man who stakes life against storm and battle, the ancestor whose courage appears purer because it belongs to an earlier world. In the work of writers such as Esaias Tegnér, whose retelling of the legendary Frithiof became widely admired beyond Sweden, the northern heroic world entered an international imagination eager for romance, tragedy and landscapes swept by sea wind. The strange feature of this revival is that it can admire pagan antiquity while living in societies profoundly shaped by Christianity. The old gods become literary and artistic figures even for readers who do not worship them. Odin can represent depth, wisdom and fatal knowledge, Thor strength and force, Valkyrie's tragic beauty, Valhalla heroic reward, Ragnarok sublime destruction. This allows the Norse past to be enjoyed as both ancestral and safely distant. A realm of symbolic power rather than an alternative religion demanding actual allegiance. Artists can fill canvases with sacrifices, funeral fires, storms and ancient temples without requiring viewers to share the belief supposedly represented. The North becomes theatrical even before it reaches an actual theatre. Its history and myth are blended into a single emotional landscape, one where archaeological distinctions matter less than whether an image feels convincingly ancient. Heroic and severe, antiquarians contribute to this atmosphere in a different but equally important way. Across Scandinavia and northern Europe, burial mounds, standing stones, runes, weapons, ornaments and ancient objects become subjects of organised study and public interest. Collections grow, learned societies form, catalogues appear, museums begin turning scattered antiquities into visible national inheritance. The material past moves from local curiosity or treasure hunting towards scholarship. Preservation and display, yet early classification is difficult, chronologies are still developing. The ability to distinguish Bronze Age objects from Iron Age objects, migration period imagery from Viking Age imagery, or ritual deposits from ordinary military equipment is not instantly secure or universally communicated. A horned prehistoric figure, a weapon from a grave, a mythological manuscript and a Viking ship image can all be drawn into the same broad impression of the heroic northern past. The disciplines that will later separate these worlds more precisely are still building their tools, while artists are already choosing the most striking forms available. This is not to say that scholars simply declared horned Bronze Age helmets to be Viking war gear. The process is subtler. The objects and texts enter a common visual reservoir. Ancient northern art contains horns, animal symbols, winged or crested figures, serpents, ravens and weapons. Norse literature contains gods, supernatural women, berserkers, sea kings, fatal battles and pagan ceremony. Medieval chronicles contain terrifying raiders. Modern nationalism seeks powerful forefathers. Romantic art seeks silhouettes capable of announcing wild grandeur from across a gallery. Each element by itself is partial. Together, they begin to form a figure more concentrated than any individual Viking could have been. He's equipped with whatever makes the ancient North instantly legible: a stormy sea, an axe, a dragon-headed ship, a beard, a shield, a cloak, an air of dangerous independence, and eventually headgear designed less from excavated evidence than from emotional necessity. The visual Viking of the early 19th century does not immediately settle into one standard costume. Artists have to invent because the surviving evidence available to them is incomplete, unevenly understood, or difficult to turn into dramatic imagery. Some portray northern warriors in equipment borrowed from classical antiquity or medieval knighthood. Others emphasize furs, bare limbs, shields, wings, crests, and archaic ornament. Painters and illustrators are not always pretending to produce archaeological reconstructions. They are constructing scenes from legend, myth, or heroic history, where the viewer expects an atmosphere of ancient difference. A plain iron helmet may be closer to what a wealthy Viking Age fighter owned, but it does not always declare primeval North strongly enough for an artist seeking immediate drama. The costume begins to accumulate signs that the man wearing it belongs not merely to the past, but to a past imagined as wilder and more elemental than Rome, chivalry, or modern Europe. Outside Scandinavia, this fascination finds fertile ground as well. The medieval and northern past attracts readers across Britain, France, and the German-speaking lands. Translations and adaptations of old Norse material spread stories that had once circulated within narrower learned circles. The idea of ancestral Germanic or northern strength becomes entangled with literary fashion, philology, folklore, and political imagination. In lands fractured into states or reorganizing under new concepts of national belonging, ancient myth can offer a deep common inheritance. The word Germanic is often used expansively, pulling together different peoples, periods, and stories into a grand ancestral world whose boundaries are more ideological than archaeological. Norse myths are especially valuable in this process because they have survived in compelling written form. Gods and heroes from Icelandic manuscripts can be summoned into modern cultural projects far beyond the islands and farms where those texts were preserved. The danger is not fascination itself. A culture is allowed to discover beauty in earlier ages, to translate poems, preserve ruins, excavate graves and imagine the emotions of the dead. The danger arrives when admiration begins to demand a simpler past than the evidence can provide. The actual Viking age is scattered, contradictory and resistant. It contains enslavers and settlers, traders and poets, farmers and hired killers, women managing farms and wealth while men travel. Kings pursuing Christian rule, pagan rituals poorly understood, contact with the Islamic world, failed Greenland farms and brief landfall in North America. Such complexity is powerful, but it is not easily made into a single national emblem. The romantic Viking is easier to raise high. He stands alone on the prow of his ship, free, fearless and untouched by compromise. His world is storm and honour, his enemies are obstacles, his violence is courage, his religion is grandeur. His equipment must therefore look as unmistakable as the meaning assigned to him. In this new climate, old ambiguities become creative opportunities. A rare figure with an unusual headpiece no longer needs to remain a difficult archaeological question. It can suggest how a pagan hero ought to appear. A horned or winged shape from a ritual setting can migrate into illustrations of myth. A god, a legendary warrior, and a historical raider can begin to borrow clothing from one another because all belong to the same imagined northern drama. The historical distinctions are not yet entirely erased, but the emotional distinctions are weakening. The more forcefully the public encounters the Old North through poetry, painted scenes, book illustrations, monuments and patriotic storytelling, the more the Viking becomes a visual role awaiting its decisive costume. There is another quiet transformation taking place. The medieval chroniclers had written of Vikings largely from outside, as invaders who ruptured order. The 19th century revival increasingly looks at them from within, or imagines that it does. The Viking is now someone's ancestor, someone's lost ideal, someone's proof that the modern nation possesses an heroic youth. His violence can be reframed as vigour, his raids can be softened into voyages of exploration and boldness. His refusal to submit can be praised as a kind of northern liberty. Even the word itself, once linked to particular expeditions and activities, expands into the name of a whole admired people and age. This larger Viking is far more useful to art than the narrow historical figure. He can stand for the North itself. And so the shoreline scene at the beginning of the story changes once more. The ship is still there, but the observers are no longer 9th century monks fearing what will happen when the keel strikes sand. They are 19th century readers, gallery visitors, theatre-goers and citizens looking backward for intensity absent from their own lives. They do not run from the arriving figure. They invite him ashore. They give him a noble profile, a tragic mythology, a national purpose and a place in the modern imagination. His real iron equipment lies damaged and seldom seen in the soil. His reconstructed form grows brighter in poems and paintings. Around his head, artists are beginning to search for the final sign that will separate him from every other ancient warrior at a glance. The horns have not yet conquered the image completely. They remain among competing choices: wings, crests, animal ornament, plain helmets, fur, bare heads, and inventions drawn from several eras at once. But the necessary world has been created for them. The Old North has become a stage of immense emotional value. The Viking has become its central male figure, enlarged by nationalism, romance and nostalgia into a heroic barbarian the public recognises before it understands. All that remains is for artists and designers to place upon him the shape already waiting in older ritual imagery and modern expectation, and to do so with enough confidence, beauty and repetition that the invented helmet will begin to feel older than the history it replaces. By the middle decades of the 19th century, the Viking has been returned to the world, but he has not yet been fixed in one final form. He stands in poems and paintings with axe and shield, appears in dramas drawn from saga and myth, and rises as an ancestor in the cultural life of Scandinavia and the wider Germanic-speaking world. His age is imagined through storms, ships, funeral fires, oath-bound warriors, and gods who move toward inevitable destruction. His face is familiar enough. His costume is still unsettled. Plain helmets appear beside winged ones, fur cloaks beside classical armour, archaeological details beside inventions assembled from romance and theatrical instinct. Then, gradually and decisively, two horns begin to rise from his head. The image is not born in a single instant, and no one person can be blamed for inventing every version of it. But it is in 19th century art and performance that the horned northern warrior passes from scattered ancient symbol to modern historical illusion. The change begins in an atmosphere where accuracy and imagination are not always enemies, because the boundary between them is understood differently. An illustrator preparing a legendary Norse scene is not necessarily attempting a museum reconstruction. A painter depicting a mythic episode is free to show gods and heroes in costumes suited to grandeur rather than daily life. A stage designer must create figures readable from far beyond the footlights, where tiny details disappear and broad silhouettes speak instantly. If the audience needs to understand that a character comes from a fierce, pagan, northern antiquity, the head is the most valuable surface available. A simple iron cap may disappear into shadow. Wings imply swiftness, messenger gods, or heroic fantasy. Horns alter the entire body. They make the figure taller, broader, more animal, more threatening and more unmistakably removed from modern life. One of the earliest important visual steps comes not from an excavated helmet, but from Swedish illustration. In the 1820s, the artist Gustav Malmström supplied images for an influential edition of Esaias Tenia's celebrated poetic work, Frithjof's Saga. The story belongs to the legendary Northern world rather than strict Viking Age documentation, and its popularity helped carry romantic images of Norse heroism to a wide audience. Malmström's early illustrations did not yet settle every convention later viewers would expect, but his subsequent work increasingly placed horned and winged headgear on figures associated with the ancient North. In later illustrated editions and Norse-themed scenes, especially during the second half of the century, his warriors helped establish a visual vocabulary in which horned helmets looked natural on saga heroes. The influence of such illustrations lies not in a formal declaration that archaeologists had found Viking horns. It lies in repetition within works audiences loved, purchased and remembered. Book illustration is a quiet but formidable engine of belief. A stage performance disappears when its run ends. A painting may remain in one gallery. An illustrated book enters homes, libraries and schools, where its images can be seen repeatedly and detached from whatever imaginative license created them. A reader encountering a northern hero beneath horns does not necessarily pause to ask whether the artist means ritual costume, legendary grandeur or documented battle equipment. The picture offers itself as the visible form of the story. If another book shows a similar helmet, and another painting echoes it, and a theatre costume confirms it, invention becomes less like an artistic option, and more like accumulated testimony. The I Remember's agreement, not the circumstances under which agreement arose. The horns also answered a practical artistic problem. A Viking warrior without them can be difficult to distinguish from other early medieval fighters. Place him in a conical iron helmet, give him a shield, sword or spear, and he may look like an Anglo-Saxon, a Norman, a Frank, or any number of armed men from centuries of European conflict. To historians, that similarity is not an inconvenience, it is a clue. These societies traded, fought, borrowed technologies, served in one another's forces and belonged to overlapping worlds of military equipment. To an illustrator who needs immediate recognition, similarity is a failure of communication. The horned helmet solves it without explanation. It turns the Viking into a pictogram. He can now be recognised from a silhouette, from a comic margin, from a theatre balcony or from a quick glance at a painted canvas. The choice was strengthened by the way 19th century artists blended history and mythology. The surviving medieval Norse texts did not separate themselves into neat modern categories. Stories of kings stand near stories of gods. Human heroes encounter prophecy, curses, monsters and magical weapons. Poems about battles invoke ravens, Valkyries and Odin's claims upon the slain, in the romantic imagination. The historical seaborne raider and the mythic northern warrior inhabit the same weather. When a god or legendary hero is given extravagant headgear, the costume can easily slide onto a historical Viking in the next illustration. A helmet meant to express the supernatural atmosphere of Valhalla does not remain confined there. It comes ashore with the raiding party because public imagination has already fused the Viking with the mythic North he is presumed to represent. This is why the horned helmet must not be understood as merely a stupid mistake. It is a highly effective design choice built from genuine associations. Even though it is historically misleading, Northern Europe did possess ancient horned imagery. The Norse religious world did include gods, animals, transformation and ritual strangeness. Viking Age art did preserve a few enigmatic figures with elaborate projections above the head. 19th century artists did not have to invent the emotional connection between horns and ancient northern power. They had to detach that connection from its sparse and ceremonial settings, expand it into ordinary heroic dress, and attach it so firmly to the Viking that later generations forgot the movement had taken place. The result is false as military history, but visually persuasive because it condenses several genuine layers of the northern past into one impossible helmet. The sculptor and designer Carl Emil Dupler would later become central to that condensation, but the soil had already been prepared before his famous theatrical work. Across art, decorated interiors, historical pageants, popular publications and museum imagination, national antiquity was being dressed for display. Costume was not a minor matter. The 19th century loved historical spectacle medieval revivals, classical revivals, national legends, operatic worlds, monuments. Illustrated epics and public festivals in which the past could be made bodily present. When people dressed as ancestors, painted heroes or watched legendary figures step onto a stage, they were not only learning what the past supposedly looked like, they were rehearsing a relationship with it. Clothing made ancestry visible, armour made courage visible, a helmet with horns made the northern past visible in its most exaggerated and intoxicating form. Some of the confusion may have been amplified by real archaeological discoveries, but not in the simple sense of a mistaken label placed on one Viking object. 19th century audiences and artists became increasingly aware that ancient Europe had produced extraordinary ceremonial helmets, animal-crested forms and horned representations. The precise chronology separating the Nordic Bronze Age from the Viking Age did not always travel into public culture with the same force as the images themselves. Even where specialists distinguished the periods correctly, artists could borrow from any ancient northern source that served the mood of a composition. The modern expectation that a visual portrayal must announce exactly one documented historical century was not necessarily governing a scene inspired by legend or opera. The trouble comes later, when those creative borrowings are consumed not as symbolic costume but as visual fact. The horned warrior also matched the 19th century's contradictory idea of the barbarian. He could be dangerous and admirable at once. Civilized Europe often imagined its own origins through peoples described as less refined but more vigorous, than the present unsoftened by luxury, unbroken by bureaucracy, near to nature, loyal to kin, fearsome in conflict and capable of founding stronger futures through violence. This was an idealised and selective fantasy, especially when applied to the varied realities of early medieval societies, yet the Viking fitted it almost perfectly. Horns increased his useful wildness. They turned him toward the animal without stripping him of human nobility. He could remain a heroic ancestor while carrying a visible trace of savagery, a man who stands outside ordinary rules yet somehow becomes the source of modern strength. In Scandinavian national art, this image could offer pride. Abroad, it could offer thrilling difference. The northern warrior with horns was not quite the same as the medieval knight, enclosed within church, castle and courtly code. He seemed older, freer and less domesticated. His ship did not need a kingdom behind it. His identity seemed to spring from sea, weapon and personal courage. This was not how real Viking expansion worked, dependent as it was on farming households, leadership, commerce, slave-taking, political alliances and the labour of many people who never stood dramatically at a prow. But visual legends thrive by narrowing. The horned man standing alone against the ocean is easier to adore than a network of ships financed by wealth, sustained by households and linked to markets and captives and silver. A crucial part of the helmet's success is that it arrived while the word Viking itself was expanding. Once a term connected to seaborne expeditions, it increasingly became the general label for a whole age and culture. This meant that any image attached to the adventurous warrior could spread outward until it seemed to describe ordinary Scandinavian antiquity as well. A saga hero receives horns, soon a raider receives horns, soon a god, a king. A settler and a merchant may all inhabit a world visually governed by horned men. Historical distinctions vanish under a single powerful brand. Even women in later comic or theatrical depictions of the Norse world can be assigned versions of the same headwear, because the helmet no longer represents equipment. It represents membership in an imagined northern universe. There were always voices capable of recognising that such portrayals were artistic rather than evidentiary. Archaeology did not stop developing simply because romantic art found a satisfying emblem. As excavation became more systematic and chronological frameworks improved, it became possible to distinguish more securely among Bronze Age ritual objects, pre-Viking elite imagery, Viking Age weapons and medieval literary memory. But public symbols do not wait politely for specialist correction. Once a shape has acquired emotional authority, facts tend to arrive as footnotes beneath it. The horned Viking could be printed cheaply, staged magnificently and understood instantly. The actual Viking helmet was rare, corroded, incomplete and aesthetically restrained. One was ready for mass culture, the other required explanation. By the later 19th century, the transformation is nearly complete in art, though it still awaits the vast amplifier that will make it internationally unavoidable. The Viking has been moved from the coastal record of frightened monks to the heroic realm of national literature, from the uncertainties of archaeology to the certainty of an illustrator's line, from a practical warrior within a complicated society to an emblem whose very head announces the modern idea of his people. The horns are now attached not because any new Viking grave demands them, but because the visual story demands them. They say pagan, northern, ancient, fierce, heroic and unlike us, all in one motion. The ship on the grey sea can now be painted for a modern audience. Its sail swells darkly, its shields form a pattern along the rail. At its prow stands the man who once emerged from archaeology in practical iron and wool. Around him, the centuries have worked their alteration. Chroniclers made him terrifying, sagas made him memorable, romantic poets made him noble, national longing made him ancestral, illustrators give him the final outline, two horns lift against the storm. And because they seem to express everything audiences have already learned to feel about the North, almost no one asks what evidence placed them there. Soon the image will leave the page, take flesh beneath stage light, and enter a musical world so immense that the horned helmet will no longer belong only to art. It will become, for millions, the face of the Viking past itself. The horns are no longer waiting in the margins of illustrated books. They are about to step into light, framed by painted mountains, illuminated mist, fire, spears, shields and music powerful enough to make invented images feel older than memory. In the late 19th century, no cultural machine is better suited to magnify the newly imagined northern past than opera. A book illustration can persuade the eye in silence, but a stage surrounds the spectator. It gives the ancient world bodies, voices, movement, weapons and scale. It makes gods descend, heroes confront destiny, women ride into death, flames rise around fortresses and entire worlds collapse under the pressure of sound. Once horned helmets enter that environment, they are no longer merely one artist's interpretation. They become part of a public revelation, repeated night after night before audiences who leave the theatre with the unmistakable outline of the mythical North fixed in their minds. The central force in this transformation is Richard Wagner's monumental cycle of 4 music dramas: Der Ring des Nibelungen, das Rheingold, Die Walküre, Siegfried and Götterdämmerung. Wagner draws from medieval German and Old Norse sources, combining, reshaping and reinventing them into a vast drama of gods, giants, treasure, desire, betrayal, power and destruction. The work is not a history of Viking raids. It does not pretend to show ordinary Scandinavian sailors attacking coastlines or trading across the Baltic. Its world is legendary and cosmic, inhabited by figures whose struggles lead ultimately to the downfall of divine order itself. Yet the visual language used to place that world on stage becomes inseparable from the larger public idea of the ancient North. In the minds of many viewers, Germanic myth, Norse gods, Valkyries and Vikings begin to inhabit the same theatrical landscape. What is seen on the heads of opera characters will soon be placed on the heads of Viking raiders far outside Wagner's story. The full cycle receives its first complete performances at the Bayreuth Festival in 1876 in the specially constructed theatre Wagner designed to realise his ambitions. The scale of the project is extraordinary. Audiences travel to witness a new kind of total artwork, in which music, poetry, scenery, costume, lighting and performance are intended to merge into a single overwhelming experience. The production needs a visual past equal to the score archaic, severe, supernatural and recognisable from a distance. Costume designer Carl Emil Dupler creates an array of garments and armour for the premiere, drawing not from one historically exact period, but from 19th century ideas about ancient Germanic and Norse appearance. His designs include headgear adorned with wings, animal elements and, crucially, horns. The famous association is sometimes compressed into the claim that Wagner invented horned Viking helmets. That is too simple. Horned northern warriors had already appeared in 19th century visual culture, and Dupler was designing mythological operatic characters rather than documentary reconstructions of Viking raiders. Wagner did not sit down and declare that historical Vikings fought in horned helmets. Yet Bayreuth matters enormously because it gives the image an international theatrical authority. The horns are now embedded in one of the century's great cultural events, attached to a world audiences understand as the heroic, pagan, northern past. Mythological costume and historical identity begin to bleed into one another with remarkable ease. The Valkyries prove especially unforgettable. In the Norse literary sources behind Wagner's reinvention, Valkyries are supernatural female figures associated with battle and with the selection of the slain. Linked to Odin and to the dangerous glory of warriors who die, Wagner transforms them into a powerful stage presence, none more famous than Brunhilde, in later popular caricature. The operatic woman in breastplate and horned helmet becomes nearly inseparable from the sound of grand opera itself. The image is so strong that even audiences who have never sat through the cycle recognise the Joker commanding soprano, braids or flowing hair, shield or spear, helmet rising into horns, holding a final note while the world waits for the curtain. Strictly speaking, this familiar image is already the result of layers of adaptation. Since early Bayreuth costumes varied and later productions amplified certain features, but its cultural effect is beyond dispute. Horns become theatrical shorthand for the entire mythic North. What happens to the Viking in this process is a kind of visual contamination, though one born from beauty rather than carelessness alone. The opera stage does not need a farmer from 10th century Norway, or a merchant from Hedeby. It needs gods, heroes and warrior maidens who appear to belong to an epic universe, but the public already associates Vikings with Norse antiquity, sea violence, pagan gods and heroic legend. When theatre presents the North through horned splendour, the historical raider absorbs the costume almost automatically. In illustrated newspapers, promotional imagery, satirical drawings, children's adaptations and later stage productions, the distinction between mythic character and Viking age person becomes increasingly fragile. A horned figure may be called Norse, Teutonic, ancient Germanic or Viking, with little concern for whether those categories match the origin of the costume. What matters is that the audience understands immediately what emotional world the horns announce. Opera is uniquely suited to turn such a shape into memory because the experience is not merely informational. A visitor does not leave Bayreuth remembering a claim to be fact-checked. The visitor remembers an impression. Brass and strings surge as figures appear in armour. The stage reveals a world that seems more intense than everyday reality. Horns catch the light above faces delivering lines of command, desire and ruin, even when spectators know they are witnessing myth. The visual association settles deeper than a historical argument. It does not say, carefully, that Viking age helmets have been recovered with horns. It says something more seductive: this is what the ancient North looks like. Once an image answers that emotional question, it is very difficult for archaeological caution to compete. Printed culture carries the stage beyond the theatre. Illustrations of operatic scenes, portraits of performers, costume designs, posters, programmes, reviews and satirical cartoons circulate forms that would otherwise vanish when the scenery is dismantled and the costume stored away. Those who never see the full ring can still encounter its northern vocabulary. As photography and reproduction improve, performance imagery becomes easier to distribute. A horned warrior or Valkyrie can appear in a publication detached from the precise context of a given act, character, or designer. The audience receiving it may not distinguish a goddess from a historical woman, a legendary hero from a Viking raider, or an opera costume from an archaeological reconstruction. Repetition does the work that evidence never did. Theatre also invites exaggeration over time. A stage costume must read from a distance, and later revivals may emphasise the features most strongly associated with earlier productions. Horns grow cleaner, larger and more obvious. The visual vocabulary becomes more standardised. What may have begun as a variety of winged, horned, animal-adorned or fantastically archaic headpieces gradually settles into the most efficient icon. 2 horns, symmetrically mounted, can be seen in a sketch. A photograph, a comic strip, or a cheap costume, they require no detailed explanation of myth, language, or chronology. By the end of the 19th century and into the 20th, the horned northern helmet is no longer dependent upon the operas that helped empower it. It has become portable. There is a revealing absurdity at the heart of its journey. The Viking Age itself was a world of mobility ships carrying people, goods, silver, weapons, captives, and beliefs from one shoreline to another. But the helmet that comes to symbolise that world undertakes a different voyage, travelling not from Scandinavian battlefield to European memory, but from deep prehistoric imagery and ritual suggestion into romantic illustration, from illustration into legendary costume, from legendary costume onto an operatic stage, and from the stage into the imagined equipment of historical raiders. It moves through association rather than evidence. Its route is not less real for that. Cultural objects can travel as powerfully as physical ones, and once the horned helmet reaches mass recognition, it becomes almost impossible to send it back to the ceremonial and theatrical settings where it belongs. The new image enters a Europe already inclined to receive it. Industrial cities, mass newspapers, expanding literacy, illustrated publications, museums, international exhibitions, consumer advertising, and new forms of popular entertainment create an audience far larger than the learned antiquarians or readers of elite poetry who first revived the northern past. The same century that searches for authentic national origins also develops the machinery capable of turning a vivid symbol into a commodity. The Viking can now be packaged for people who have little interest in the patient distinctions of historians. He must be understandable in an instant. Horns make him excellent for this new life. They allow him to be printed small, shown in profile, rendered comically or heroically, dressed in almost any degree of historical nonsense and still recognised at once. At the same time, scholarly knowledge is advancing in directions that ought to weaken the myth. Archaeology becomes more systematic, chronologies improve, Scandinavian museums collect, classify and exhibit actual Viking Age material. Ships such as those later excavated at Gokstad and Oseberg reveal a world whose reality is more astonishing than many earlier fantasies, expertly crafted vessels preserved in burial mounds, accompanied by objects of workmanship and ceremony that show both practical mastery and extraordinary social power. Actual helmets and helmet fragments, however rare, do not carry the stage horns. The widening gap between evidence and costume becomes increasingly visible to specialists, but the public imagination does not operate like a museum catalogue. A ship can be genuinely Viking and still carry an actor wearing a false helmet on its deck. Authentic elements do not automatically displace the symbol already anchored in the mind. The irony deepens because Wagner's world is not dependent upon Vikings at all. Its power lies in myth, music, and drama. Gods and legendary heroes are free to wear astonishing costumes because they do not have to match the equipment of an excavated warrior. A horned or winged helmet on an operatic being can be historically irrelevant and artistically effective. The error happens when later audiences strip the costume from its setting and treat it as a report on ordinary life in the Viking Age. This error is understandable, perhaps almost inevitable, in a culture that uses the same word cloud of associations for all things northern and ancient Odin: Valkyrie, longship, berserker, rune, Viking, horned helmet. Yet understandable is not the same as accurate. From the perspective of a Viking Age craftsman, the entire development would be bewildering. A smith labouring to form useful iron plates for a wealthy warrior's helmet does not know that centuries later his restrained, functional work will be overshadowed by an object never recovered from the grave of his world. A sailor struggling against a rough crossing does not know that his descendants in imagination will be recognised less by seamanship than by headgear made famous in theatres. A woman managing a farm, burying a relative, wearing a brooch, or commissioning a memorial does not know that the civilization around her will be compressed into an operatic silhouette. None of them can object. The silence allows the stage to speak loudly in their place. And loudly it speaks. The storm no longer belongs only to the North Sea. It rolls across an orchestra. The spear is no longer only a weapon carried on a raid or laid in a grave. It is a prop raised beneath lights as a theme swells and a divine world moves toward destruction. The helmet no longer needs to survive in corroded fragments. It is remade for every performance, shining, visible, undeniable to the eye. On that stage, horns finally acquire what Viking Age archaeology never gave them: overwhelming presence. They are grand, emotionally persuasive, unforgettable, and completely capable of travelling beyond the mythological characters who wore them. When the curtain falls, the audience carries the silhouette away, into printed pages, humorous sketches, schoolroom images, product labels, and later cinema it goes, increasingly detached from Bayreuth, from Wagner, from Dupler, and from the 19th century longing that shaped it. Soon people will no longer need an opera to understand the figure. A child will see a helmet with two horns and name a Viking. A merchant will use the figure to sell goods. A filmmaker will place it on a raider because the audience already expects it. A sports team will turn it into aggressive identity. The myth has escaped its theatrical birthplace. It no longer waits for music to make it convincing. It has become its own performance, repeated wherever modern culture needs the North to be fierce, funny, heroic, or instantly known. Once an image escapes the theatre, it no longer needs anyone to remember where it came from. The horned figure can abandon the painted rocks and operatic flames, shrink onto a printed page, brighten into a comic drawing, stand smiling on a shop counter, charge across a cinema screen, appear above a sports crowd, or sit in plastic upon the head of a child who has never heard the name of Wagner. Its history becomes unnecessary to its success. What matters is recognition. 2 horns, a beard, perhaps a round shield or an axe, and the eye completes the story in an instant. Viking. The image that archaeology could not find in a warrior grave begins to reproduce everywhere. Modern life offers a surface paper, packaging, advertising signs, school illustrations, beer labels, postcards, carnival costumes, television screens, helmets worn by cheering fans. The invented object succeeds not because anyone proves it, but because everyone understands it. The late 19th and early 20th centuries are perfectly equipped for this kind of spread. Printing becomes cheaper and more abundant. Newspapers and magazines rely increasingly on images to catch attention. Illustrated books bring distant times and places into ordinary homes. Public education creates large audiences for simplified historical pictures. National exhibitions, museums and tourist industries turn the past into something people can visit, admire and purchase in miniature. A child need not read a saga or encounter an excavated helmet to receive a version of the Viking Age. He may see a coloured illustration of a longship whose crew all wear horns, then meet the same outline in a toy, a classroom poster, or a humorous drawing. Each encounter confirms the previous one. The helmet begins to operate like a remembered fact because it is repeated with the confidence normally reserved for facts. Children's books have particular power in this process. Historical complexity is difficult to communicate in a small image accompanying an adventurous tale. The Viking who appears in a story for young readers must often be identifiable immediately, perhaps while standing beside Romans, knights, pirates, explorers, or kings. Horns distinguish him more quickly than any accurate explanation of shipbuilding, silver trade, Norse settlement, or the limited survival of early medieval helmets. An illustrator who uses them may not intend to deceive. The horns simply do the work of a label without requiring words. But early recognition has lasting effects. Once a child learns that Vikings are the people with horns, a later correction must compete not with ignorance, but with an image already linked to excitement, danger, humour, and childhood certainty. A practical iron helmet can feel strangely disappointing, as though history itself has removed the most memorable detail. The horned Viking also proves irresistible to humour. Serious myths can be cumbersome. Comic myths travel lightly. A grim raider in a carefully reconstructed helmet might require context before a joke is understood. Give him enormous horns, a bushy beard and an axe far too large for sensible use, and he's instantly available for parody. He can complain about modern life, misunderstand telephone, order too much food, discover bureaucracy, drink from an exaggerated horn, or appear at a door with the wrong century's manners. His violence becomes safely cartoonish because his equipment already signals fantasy. He is no longer the human participant in raids, captivity, and political conquest. He's a lovable or foolish brute, rough around the edges but rarely truly threatening. The horns help domesticate him. They take a historical figure who caused real suffering and make him a comic guest in the modern household. Newspaper cartoons discover that this costume can be applied not only to Viking history, but to anything described as invading, northern, forceful, unruly, or old-fashioned. A horned figure can represent Scandinavian identity, aggressive business, naval threat, an arriving sports opponent, or a joking version of masculine appetite. Political caricature depends on quick visual recognition, and the horned helmet becomes a convenient symbol detached almost completely from its original 19th century artistic setting. The Viking is now not always meant to be a Viking. He's a tool for representing qualities: conquest, toughness, noise, intrusion, appetite, ruggedness, cold weather, male bravado, cheerful barbarism. Every new use strengthens the visual code. The public no longer asks whether actual Norse warriors wore such helmets, because the helmet has become a word in a language of pictures. Advertising takes this usefulness and gives it commercial muscle. Products linked with strength, endurance, northern origin, adventure, beer, travel, or rough humour find a ready mascot in the horned warrior. He can lift barrels, cross icy seas, raise a mug, conquer hunger, survive winter, sell holidays, or promise that a product possesses something bold and uncompromising. The actual Viking world, with its slavery, farming, textiles, law, long-distance exchange, and uncertain religious traces, would only complicate the message. Advertising requires compression. The horned helmet is compression perfected. In one glance, it offers cold seas, masculine force, ancient tradition, and an almost comic willingness to charge ahead. It is inaccurate history, but excellent branding. Tourism repeats the exchange in another form. Travellers visiting Scandinavia seek contact with the past they already half know through popular culture. Museums may carefully display ships, grave goods, runestones, tools, ornaments, and reconstructions based on evidence. Nearby, souvenir shops can offer horned caps, miniature figures, novelty helmets, mugs, shirts, magnets, and postcards because those are what many visitors expect to find. The contradiction can be almost comic. A museum explanation may state clearly that Viking warriors did not normally wear horned helmets, while a shop within easy walking distance sells the image because it remains the easiest object through which visitors announce that they have encountered Viking country. The correction and the myth coexist. not because knowledge has failed completely, but because accuracy and souvenir recognition serve different desires. One tells people what the past most likely was. The other gives them the past they can wear in a photograph. Museums themselves face a more subtle challenge. They are guardians of evidence, but they also receive visitors whose expectations were shaped long before entry. A visitor arriving to see Vikings may look first for horns, ships, axes, and violent spectacle. A good exhibition can use that expectation as an opening, confronting the myth and revealing the much wider Norse world behind it. Yet even the decision to debunk the horned helmet confirms how central the symbol has become. The absence must be explained because the visitor feels its presence. A gallery case containing a real helmet fragment may look small, corroded and visually quiet beside the magnificent false object living in memory. The museum has to teach the eye to value the difficult truth. An incomplete piece of iron may carry more human history than 1,000 dramatic horns. Cinema magnifies the Viking again, just as opera once did, but now for an audience unimaginably larger. Early film inherits the visual vocabulary already built by painting, theatre and illustration. It wants audiences to understand characters before plot and dialogue have done much work. Ships, furs, shields, swords, beards and helmets become part of the screen's shorthand for the Northern warrior. Some productions use horned helmets directly. Others avoid them but retain the exaggerated wildness they helped establish. Historical accuracy competes with audience expectation, budget, spectacle, and the need for a poster image that can sell an adventure. A director may know that horns are dubious and still fear that a hornless warrior looks insufficiently Viking to viewers trained by generations of imagery. The myth begins to exert pressure even on those who doubt it. By the mid-20th century, animation and comic art can carry the figure farther still. Animated Vikings need clear silhouettes and broad visual signals, especially when placed in scenes filled with other characters. Horns can move comically, snag on doors, puncture objects, frame facial expressions and remain visible even when the body is reduced to a few bold lines. Comic strip Vikings turn history into cheerful absurdity, inhabiting villages, taverns, ships and family life that borrow more from modern jokes than from medieval Scandinavia. Their world is not claiming archaeological authority, yet it matters deeply because it reaches audiences more frequently than scholarship does. A person may never open a book on Viking Age material culture, but may see horned comic figures for decades. Familiarity is patient. It does not argue. It simply arrives again and again until correction feels like an interruption. Television makes the myth domestic. The horned Viking enters living rooms through comedy sketches, cartoons, commercials, game shows, children's programming, historical adventures, and televised sporting events. He no longer needs a special trip to a gallery, theatre, or cinema. He appears between ordinary activities, casual and repeated. Sometimes he's presented knowingly as a cliché. The joke depends on audiences' understanding that the image is exaggerated. But even parody can preserve the underlying association. Laughing at the horned Viking still rehearses the link between Viking and horns. An image can be recognised as foolish and remain dominant at the same time. Indeed, its foolishness may make it more memorable than a serious correction. No modern arena has used this effect more visibly than sport. Teams searching for names and mascots often turn to figures associated with strength, aggression, endurance, and collective identity. The Viking offers all of these, especially in places with Scandinavian immigrant heritage or with a desire to invoke toughness and cold weather resilience. When the mascot appears, historical subtlety is not the goal. A sporting emblem needs to be visible from a distance, printable on merchandise, wearable by fans and forceful enough to represent confrontation. The horned helmet is nearly ideal. Crowds can wear it, logos can simplify it, a giant costumed figure can charge onto a field in it. The historical era now becomes ritual of a new kind modern communities gathering in colour and noise, placing horns upon themselves not because they believe they are reenacting Viking Age warfare with scholarly precision, but because the image has come to mean energy, belonging and battle in the harmless formal world of a game. The irony is difficult to miss. There may have been rare ancient northern ceremonies in which unusual horned headgear marked a transformed or exceptional figure. Centuries later, stadiums fill with thousands of people wearing cheap horns as a sign of temporary group identity. The meaning is entirely different, but the basic visual mechanism survives. Horns lift the wearer out of ordinary appearance. They declare participation in a performance. In the ancient past, that performance may have touched religion, authority, or sacred danger. In the modern stadium, it touches loyalty, play, rivalry, and spectacle. The Viking Age did not hand this tradition directly to the crowd, yet the invented Viking helmet has become a costume through which modern people perform their own version of northern strength. Popular music, festivals, and themed entertainment add still more layers. A Viking feast offered to tourists may combine historical food research with costumes chosen primarily for atmosphere. A festival may include carefully informed reenactors beside visitors in novelty horned hats. A restaurant, amusement venue, or themed event may decorate its rooms with longships, shields, runes, and horns, blending genuine cultural references with inventions too recognisable to discard. Modern fantasy. Heavy metal imagery and games may borrow Norse gods, Viking ships and horned helmets without any obligation to distinguish history from imagination. In a fictional world, there is no reason a warrior cannot wear horns if the artist wants him to, yet when fantasy repeatedly borrows the same costume from popular history, and popular history has already borrowed it from fantasy, the circle closes. People recognise the horned Viking because so many invented Vikings resemble one another. At times, more historically grounded film and television productions deliberately remove the horns. Their warriors wear wool, leather in plausible uses, mail where wealth allows, practical helmets or uncovered heads. They trade, farm, scheme, prey, enslave, travel and struggle within worlds presented as rougher and more complex than old cartoons allowed. Such portrayals can reshape public understanding, but even they often depend on the old myth as a contrast. Reviews and conversations praise them for showing Vikings without horned helmets, as though the absence of a false item is itself a daring artistic decision. This reveals how powerful the silhouette remains. Accuracy must announce itself by refusing the thing audiences still half expect to see. Through all these transformations, the horned helmet becomes more durable precisely because it loses any single owner. It no longer belongs to Bronze Age ritual, Viking Age ambiguity, romantic painting or Wagnerian costume. It belongs to everyone who recognises it. It can be serious or comic, admired or mocked, worn by a mascot or rejected by a museum curator. Each appearance reinforces its speed as a symbol, even when the appearance explains that the symbol is wrong. The real Viking helmet remains an artifact requiring patience-corroded iron, missing pieces, cautious reconstruction, the weight of uncertainty. The false helmet is effortless. It arrives complete, symmetrical and expressive, asking nothing except to be remembered. So the horned figure crosses the modern world with far greater ease than any longship crossed an ocean. He appears wherever history must be sold, simplified, celebrated or laughed at. In doing so, he changes the question most people ask. They no longer wonder what Viking Age people actually wore, how rarely helmets survive, or why a ceremonial symbol from an older North became attached to raiders centuries later. They simply feel that horns belong there. Repetition has done what excavation could not. It has furnished the Viking with a helmet more indestructible than iron, not buried in any grave, but preserved in the vast, crowded museum of public memory. Why does the false helmet endure when the correction is so simple? No convincing Viking Age battle helmet with horns has been found. The finest surviving evidence points elsewhere. Museums say it, archaeologists say it, historians repeat it so often that the correction has almost become a cultural ritual of its own, and still, draw two curved horns above a bearded face, and the Viking appears instantly, as if summoned from some deep collective storehouse. Remove them, and something curious happens. The man may become more accurate, but for many viewers he also becomes less immediate. He's now an armed early medieval sailor in wool and iron, perhaps dangerous, perhaps important, but no longer quite the figure they were trained to identify in a single glance. The horns survive because they do not merely sit on the Viking's head. They perform work inside the modern imagination. They tell the eye what to see before the mind has time to ask whether it is true. A real historical culture is difficult to compress. The Viking Age stretches across centuries and vast distances, from farmsteads beside Norwegian fjords to trading settlements on the Baltic, from Dublin and Normandy to river routes leading toward Byzantium and the Islamic world, from Iceland and Greenland to a brief Norse foothold at the edge of North America. It includes kings and captives, artisans and poets, pagan rites and Christian conversion, ships built for cargo and ships built for war. Silver weighed in markets and violence inflicted on undefended shores. No single object can honestly contain all of that. But popular memory is rarely patient enough to carry the full weight of a society every time its name is mentioned. It seeks a sign, a shape, one visual hook on which the larger idea can hang. For Egypt, pyramids and striped royal headcloths do the work. For Rome, eagle standards and crested helmets. For medieval knighthood, plate armour centuries too late for many scenes in which it appears. For the Viking, the horned helmet wins because it is both impossible to miss and impossible to confuse with anything else. The horns solve a problem accurate equipment cannot solve as efficiently. A Viking Age warrior wearing a practical iron helmet with a nasal guard may look very similar to other armed men of Northern and Western Europe. That similarity reflects historical reality, technology moves across borders, warriors meet in war, service and trade, armour follows usefulness more readily than modern national stereotypes. A Scandinavian fighter in mail and a guarded helmet is not supposed to resemble a creature from another planet. He belongs to the same violent, early medieval world as many of the people he attacks, serves beside, marries into, trades with, or eventually rules. Yet visual storytelling often depends on separation. The audience wants to know immediately which man is the Viking, which is the Saxon, which is the Norman, which is the knight, which is the barbarian at the gate. Horns do not describe that shared historical world, they tear the Viking out of it and give him a private emblem. The transformation is especially effective because horns change a human silhouette into something edged with animal meaning. A plain helmet covers and protects. A horned helmet extends, it widens the head, adds height, sharpens the outline, and creates the suggestion that the wearer is not entirely governed by the limits of ordinary men. A bull does not need explanation before its horns are understood as strength, challenge, and potential violence. A stag crowned with antlers carries other associations: wildness, mastery of the forest, display, season, and ritual grandeur. The horned Viking borrows from both without having to declare either. He becomes larger, fiercer, and more primitive in the imagination, not because Viking Age people understood themselves that way, but because modern viewers respond quickly to an animalized human form. The theatrical artists who promoted the image understood its effect. Whether consciously or instinctively, horns made a northern warrior legible not simply as ancient, but as dangerous in a way that felt rooted in nature itself. This is where the myth achieves its strange balance. The horned Viking is savage enough to threaten, but grand enough to admire. Make him too brutal and he becomes merely repellent, a figure of murder and enslavement with little romantic appeal. Make him too civilized and he loses the thrilling distance that made 19th century audiences, and many later ones, look northward with fascination. The horns permit both feelings at once. They mark him as wild, pagan and violent, yet also magnificent, almost royal in his barbaric splendour. On the head of a villain they make him fearsome. On the head of a hero they make him fearless. On the head of a comic mascot they make him harmlessly exuberant. Few historical inventions are so adaptable. The same false object can glorify, mock, frighten or sell, depending on the expression beneath it. The sea reinforces the feeling. When modern audiences picture Vikings, they do not generally begin with a loom weight, a balance scale, a legal assembly, or a woman supervising a farmstead while relatives are abroad. They begin with arrival, dark water, rough wind, a high prow, men moving toward an unfamiliar shore. The Viking is remembered in motion, at the edge between one world and another. Horns fit that scene because they appear at a distance, long before a face can be read. Before a shield design can be understood or a sword recognised, the outline tells the people on shore what has come. In truth, the sight of sails, armed men and a sudden landing would have been terrifying enough. But visual myth improves on fear by making the attacker instantly symbolic. He no longer merely threatens a monastery or village, he brings the whole imagined violence of the north upon his head. There is also a reason the correction so often fails to dislodge the image people can know something is wrong, while still using it fluently. A person may say, with complete accuracy, that Vikings did not really wear horned helmets in battle, then choose a horned Viking costume for a party, laugh at a horned Viking cartoon, recognise a horned logo, or picture horns again the moment a Viking is mentioned. Knowledge and imagery do not always occupy the same chamber of memory. The fact can be stored as an interesting correction, while the silhouette remains the faster pathway. Indeed, the correction itself sometimes strengthens the myth by repeating the association. Vikings did not wear horns still places Vikings and horns together in the same sentence. The same museum panel, the same quiz question, the same classroom discussion. The error becomes famous for being false, and thus continues to be famous. This pattern is not unique to the Vikings. Historical imagery is filled with inventions that survive because they communicate efficiently. Pirates are given a standardized costume assembled from many eras. Gladiators are flattened into a handful of dramatic types. Ancient peoples who lived complicated agricultural and urban lives may be reduced to one weapon, one hairstyle, one ruin, or one ritual. These images do not endure only because audiences are careless. They endure because they provide entry points, and entry points are useful. The problem begins when the doorway is mistaken for the entire building. Horns can introduce a viewer to a question about Vikings, perhaps even provoke the satisfying surprise that the real story is different, but when they replace that story, they leave an entire society standing behind a costume it never chose. The horned helmet also flatters modern expectations about violence. Real raiding is organised, calculating and dependent on logistics. It requires ships maintained by labour, intelligence about vulnerable targets, agreements among leaders and crews, supplies for voyages, markets for stolen goods and captives, and political conditions that allow violence to succeed. This kind of violence is disturbing because it is human and rational. The horned Viking offers a more comfortable form of danger. He looks as if he raids because he is inherently wild, as if the explanation for brutality can be worn visibly on the head. Horns shift attention away from economies of slavery, tribute, land hunger, royal competition and opportunity, and toward an imagined temperament. The raider becomes a beast from the north rather than a person making choices within a social system. That distortion can romanticize him, but it can also make him less historically accountable. At the same time, horns flatter admiration for exploration. The same figure who can be shown descending violently upon an English shore can be shown looking heroically across an Atlantic horizon. In the explorer version, the horns are no longer marks of menace but of boldness, an ornamental declaration that this band dares to travel beyond the known. The true achievement of Norse seafaring needs no such decoration. To cross the North Atlantic in open water voyages, settle Iceland. Establish farms in Greenland and reach Newfoundland was a remarkable accomplishment of navigation, shipbuilding, experience, and collective endurance. But those achievements involve knowledge, labour, and risk distributed among communities, not only the solitary courage of a heroic male figure. The horned Viking condenses the achievement into one romantic body at the prow, magnificent and misleading in equal measure. Perhaps the strongest power of the image lies in its apparent age, because horns feel primitive. They seem older than the 19th century world that attached them to Vikings. This is an illusion with roots in something real. Horned ceremonial objects and images do exist in the deeper European past. Ritual transformations involving animal attributes are ancient and widespread. Unusual headgear does appear in northern imagery that scholars interpret with caution. When modern artists gave horns to the Viking, they borrowed a symbol already heavy with antiquity. The invention therefore did not look newly made. It looked uncovered, as though artists were merely revealing what had always been there. That quality allows the myth to survive correction. The horns feel archaeologically true even when Viking Age archaeology does not support them, because they belong emotionally to a generalised ancient world of ritual, warfare and pagan mystery. The evidence remains incomplete, as it always must for a society separated from the present by a millennium. It is possible that some unusual Viking Age individual wore some form of horned or animal-linked headgear in a ceremony, a performance, a religious context or an elite display. Images from around the Viking world make complete dismissal of exceptional costume unwise, but this sliver of possibility cannot carry the immense weight popular culture places upon it. It cannot turn special ritual imagery into the standard helmet of raiders, traders, settlers or warriors. The distinction is not pedantic. It is the difference between respecting a mysterious trace and forcing it to tell a story audiences already prefer. There is a final reason the horns remain the real Viking is more difficult to own. The horned version can be turned into almost anything without resistance. He can be a mascot, a cartoon, an adventurer, a villain, a brand, a drinking companion, a fantasy warrior or a national symbol. The real inhabitants of the Viking Age resist such easy possession. They bring uncomfortable facts with them. Their world is beautiful in its craft and poetry, impressive in its mobility and navigation, but also harsh in its hierarchies and ruthless in its violence. It contains no single heroic moral. It cannot be reduced to either enlightened explorer or blood-soaked barbarian. Its people are recognisable in some ways and profoundly distant in others. To meet them requires attention, not merely recognition. And yet, once the horns have been lifted away, something unexpected happens. The Viking does not become smaller. The opposite is true. The man beneath the false helmet no longer has to perform an invented savagery for the modern eye. He can return to the actual strangeness of his world, the smell of wet wool and tar, the silver cut for weighing, the comb tucked among personal belongings, the ship drawn over land or driven through dangerous seas, the grave mound receiving objects of status and grief, the poetry that turns battle into raven feast and ocean into road, the captive who experiences the voyage not as adventure but as catastrophe, the settler staring at a coast never seen by ancestors. Horns offered an immediate shape, their absence restores a deeper landscape. On the misted shore, the approaching figure now carries no enormous curve above his head. His outline is less theatrical, and for that reason more unsettling. There is no animal emblem explaining him away. There is only an armed human being, equipped as wealth and circumstance allow, arriving from a society complicated enough to trade, compose, explore, enslave, settle, worship, negotiate, and kill. The false helmet made him easy to recognise. The real one makes him harder to dismiss. Somewhere in that difference lies the reason myths are comforting. Even when they pretend to be frightening, they give the past a costume, and a costume allows the viewer to believe the past has been understood. Once the horns are gone, the shoreline does not empty, it becomes crowded. The single broad-shouldered raider standing at the prow dissolves into hundreds of lives moving through the northern world, a shipwright selecting oak with the judgment of a lifetime, a woman at a loom producing the woolen sail without which an overseas voyage remains only ambition, a trader weighing hacked silver in a market town, a captive forced aboard a vessel whose voyage means exile rather than adventure, a poet shaping a ruler's violence into praise, a farmer calculating whether a son's absence can be afforded through harvest, a smith making rivets, blades, and tools, a settler driving livestock into a new landscape whose winters have not yet revealed their full cruelty, a navigator studying wind, swell, birds, cloud, and remembered routes, a warrior lifting a shield because the world he inhabits has made violence profitable, honourable, necessary or impossible to escape. The horned helmet made the Vikings visible by reducing them to one figure. The real history becomes visible only when that figure breaks apart. Consider the ship again, not as a silhouette gliding dramatically through mist, but as an achievement built out of woodland, iron, tar, wool, animal hair, time and communal skill. A long vessel is not conjured by an adventurous spirit. Trees must be found whose grain and form suit particular timbers. Planks must be split and shaped with extraordinary precision, clinker built so their overlapping edges give the hull strength and flexibility. Iron rivets and roves hold the structure together. Caulking seals seams against the cold invasion of water. Oars must be carved, rope prepared, sails woven and treated, provisions loaded, repairs anticipated. The sail alone represents immense labour, likely hundreds or even thousands of hours of spinning or weaving and preparation, much of it carried out by women whose work rarely occupies the heroic centre of Viking stories. A fleet crossing the sea is therefore not merely a gathering of men seeking wealth. It is an enormous investment of stored labour, agricultural surplus, skilled craft and social obligation. Every dramatic voyage begins long before the ship touches water. The ships also reveal how incomplete the word raider is. Broad-bellied cargo vessels carry goods and animals rather than assault forces. Smaller boats stitch local communities together across fjords and islands. Trading ships move along coasts and rivers with cargoes that may include iron, soapstone vessels, antler, hides, timber, walrus ivory, whetstones, amber, textiles, weapons, slaves and silver, at market centres such as Hiddeby, Birka, Kaupang, Ribe and Dublin. The Viking world does not appear as a horde paused temporarily between attacks. It appears as dense activity craftsmen manufacturing combs, beads and metal fittings, traders bargaining across languages, coins and weighed bullion changing hands, imported glass, silk or wine reaching northern consumers, houses and workshops standing near landing places where vessels arrive with news as well as goods. The sea does carry raiders. But it also carries a commercial intelligence capable of recognizing opportunity across an enormous region. That intelligence reaches astonishing distances. Silver dirhams struck in Islamic lands flow north through river routes and trading networks until they are worn, clipped or buried in Scandinavian hoards. Norse travellers pass eastward into the worlds of the Rus and Byzantium. Some enter service in the Varangian Guard, where northern warriors and their descendants become associated with the protection of emperors in Constantinople. Others move west to Ireland and Britain, to the islands of the North Atlantic, to Iceland and eventually Greenland. No single motive explains these movements. Some seek payment or gifts, some follow displaced leaders or family networks. Some are drawn by land, trade or political advantage. Some are forced to move by enslavement. Some may simply inherit the fact that an earlier generation made a new home abroad. The Viking Age is not a burst of chaos fired outward from Scandinavia and then extinguished. It is a reorganisation of lives around routes that transform both those who travel and those who receive them. In England, Scandinavian armies do not merely strike and disappear. They seize territory, establish rule, settle, farm, mint coins, influence language and reshape political geography. The region later associated with the Danelaw becomes a landscape in which Scandinavian names, legal customs, settlements and families mingle with existing Anglo-Saxon communities in ways that cannot be reduced to either invasion or peaceful assimilation alone. Violence opens doors that settlement then complicates. A sword may win land, a plough keeps it. A man remembered by outsiders as part of an attacking army may end his life concerned with boundaries, inheritance, harvests and agreements with neighbours whose fathers once feared the sight of his fleet. His children may grow up in a world where identity is mixed, practical and local rather than cleanly divided between Viking and English. In Ireland, Norse settlements become urban engines as well as military bases. Dublin grows into a major port connected to trade and slavery, a place where the wealth of movement is inseparable from human suffering. The archaeological evidence of streets, workshops, combs, weights, amber, textiles and imported objects restores daily life to a history often dominated by battles in the annals. People are born in such towns, make objects, prepare food, cross cultural boundaries, marry, worship, trade and die there. At the same time, captives pass through the same economic system. The town that offers opportunity and craft production to some becomes a centre of sale and forced separation for others. Nothing exposes the inadequacy of the cartoon Viking more completely than this double reality. The same maritime networks that create thriving settlements also make human bodies into transportable wealth. The enslaved remain among the hardest people to see clearly because power decides what is commemorated. An elite burial can preserve a ship, weapons and ornaments. A ruler may be praised in poetry. A voyager may have a stone raised to his name. The person seized in an Irish raid, traded through Dublin, taken into a Scandinavian household or sent onward along a route of exchange is less likely to leave an identifiable voice. Yet forced labour supports farms, households, ships and status. Captive women may be absorbed into families under conditions no romantic account of settlement should soften. Genetic evidence from North Atlantic communities has revealed patterns consistent with Scandinavian male migration, accompanied in part by women from the British Isles and Ireland, some of whom may have travelled willingly, while others almost certainly did not. The evidence cannot narrate every individual fate. It does insist that the Viking expansion contains lives moved by coercion, alongside those celebrated for daring. Women of the Norse world stand far beyond the vague role of waiting at home for men to return. Their circumstances vary greatly by status, wealth and freedom, and no modern fantasy of effortless equality should be imposed upon a patriarchal society. Yet women manage farms and estates, control significant household production, participate in exchange, carry keys and jewellery that signal authority, migrate into new settlements, become central to family alliances, perform or commission ritual acts, and in some cases receive burials of immense prestige. The Osberg ship burial, containing 2 women interred with a splendid vessel, carved objects, textiles, animals and vehicles, remains one of the Viking Age's most spectacular surviving monuments. Their exact identities and the meaning of the burial remain debated, but the grave alone disrupts any world imagined solely around axe-bearing men. Power, ritual, ancestry and memory could gather around women with overwhelming material force. Nor is every weapon in a grave evidence of a lifetime spent raiding. Weapons can signal status, inheritance, identity, and the expectations attached to free adulthood or elite affiliation. Recent debate around certain burials, including the richly equipped grave at Birka in Sweden identified through genetic analysis as that of a biological female, has brought fresh attention to the possibility of women connected directly with martial roles. Interpretation remains cautious. Grave goods do not function as simple occupational labels, and a single burial cannot establish the frequency or nature of female warriors across Norse society. Yet the controversy itself reveals how modern assumptions shape the past. For centuries, the stereotype expected every impressive armed burial to be male while simultaneously placing imaginary horns on those men. Archaeology continues to challenge both habits, not by replacing one fantasy with another, but by allowing evidence to make the world less predictable. Poetry makes that world audible, though not transparent. A skald attached to a ruler performs a craft as demanding as any metalworker's, constructing verse in complex meters dense with illusion and compressed imagery. A ship becomes a steed of the waves. Battle feeds ravens, gold, generosity. Ancestry and victory are arranged into praise capable of preserving a ruler's name long after his body is gone. The poet does not stand outside power. His art can legitimize kings, celebrate killing, mock enemies and turn the redistribution of plunder into moral greatness. But he also reveals a society that prizes verbal mastery alongside martial success. A Viking Age hall is not defined only by the clash of weapons. It is a place where memory is made through language, where reputation can outlast the men who fought for it, and where an insult or a verse may carry consequences as real as steel. Religion alters with movement and rule. Thor's hammer amulets and Christian crosses appear within overlapping worlds, rather than in a single clean moment of replacement. Kings convert for conviction, diplomacy, advantage or several motives at once. Subjects respond unevenly. Old ritual habits may endure beneath new forms or vanish without record. Churches rise, burials change. Royal authority increasingly ties itself to Christian legitimacy and European kingship. The Viking Age often appears in popular memory as the final blazing hour of pagan Northmen before Christianity extinguishes something freer and more primal. Reality is more complicated. Conversion can be forced and violent, but it also creates new alliances, literacy, institutions and forms of memory through which much Norse literature ultimately survives. The sagas that preserve the drama of pagan ancestors are written in Christian societies. Without that later world, much of the older one would be even more silent. At the western edge of their range, Norse settlers face landscapes capable of defeating every heroic expectation. Iceland offers grazing, fisheries, law and new farms, but also volcanic danger, erosion, and a social world requiring careful negotiation among settlers. Greenland demands even more. Farms established in the southwest survive for centuries through livestock, hunting, trade and adaptation, connected to Europe by fragile sea routes and dependent in part on valuable walrus ivory. These are not fantasy outposts of men simply conquering ice through toughness. They are vulnerable communities navigating climate variation, environmental limits, changing trade demand and distance. Their eventual disappearance from Greenland is not explained by one dramatic final catastrophe. Scholars still debate the balance among cooling conditions, economic change, isolation, environmental stress, mobility, and social decisions. The horned hero has no useful answer here. Survival depends on hay, seals, boats, church ties, trade and choices made over generations. Farther west still, at Lonceau Meadows in Newfoundland, timber structures and artifacts confirm that Norse travellers reached North America around the turn of the first millennium. The discovery is extraordinary, not because it turns every saga episode into literal record or because it validates later fantasies of conquest, but because it demonstrates the outer range of a navigational culture whose ships and knowledge could carry people across the North Atlantic. Their presence appears limited and brief. They did not establish a lasting Norse colony there, and indigenous peoples already inhabited and understood the continent into which the newcomers arrived. The significance lies not in claiming a continent for Viking glory, but in recognising the reach, daring and limits of those voyages. Even at their greatest distance, the Norse are not mythical conquerors. They are humans at the edge of their logistical world, seeking resources and opportunity in landscapes where remaining may be harder than arriving. All of this stands behind the word Viking. When the horns are removed, ships produced through immense labour, ports crowded with exchange, silver moving across continents, raids that devastate communities, captives reduced to property, settlers turning violence into new homes, women exercising authority within constrained but significant roles, poets preserving fame, craftspeople shaping objects of intricate beauty, kings using faith and force to build realms, migrants enduring volcanic islands and Greenland winters, explorers reaching a shore beyond the known horizon of Europe, and ordinary households whose work sustains every venture later dressed as heroic adventure. This world does not need to be made more dramatic. It needs only to be allowed its full contradictions. The practical helmet from the grave now seems almost merciful in its honesty. It does not pretend the wearer is an animal, a myth, or an emblem. It is iron placed around a human head, made by skill, acquired through privilege, perhaps worn into danger and ultimately claimed by burial. Beneath it was a person who belonged to some part of this wide, difficult world. He may have fought for silver, land, loyalty, survival, or ambition. He may have been admired, feared, mourned, or hated. His identity cannot be fully restored from corroded metal, but the absence of horns returns him to humanity, and humanity is not a reduction of his power, it is the source of it. The Viking behind the costume is therefore harder to celebrate carelessly and harder to dismiss cheaply. He and the society around him possessed genuine achievements, genuine beauty, genuine endurance, and genuine cruelty. They made routes where others saw distances. They left poetry, ships, cities, graves, words embedded in later languages and settlements whose traces still shape landscapes. They also burned, enslaved, extorted, and conquered. The truth resists both the snarling monster and the heroic mascot. It asks for something more demanding than recognition, a willingness to look at people of the past without forcing them to perform the simplicity modern memory finds comforting. On the shore, the hornless figures have now come into focus. They are less like a legend, and far more difficult to forget. By now, the helmet has become an absence with a history of its own. It is absent from the Viking warrior graves where modern expectation looks for it, absent from the best surviving iron helmets recovered from the Viking Age, absent from the accounts of terrified communities who saw Scandinavian ships arrive and had every reason to remember anything monstrous about the men who stepped ashore. Yet it is present almost everywhere else on shelves and screens, in stadiums and school books, in comic drawings and festival photographs, in the easy mental picture called forward by a single word. Few historical objects have achieved such fame without having belonged to the people they supposedly define. The horned Viking helmet is not merely an error attached to the past. It is a monument to the power of later generations to build a past that looks clearer, louder, and more satisfying than the one that actually survived. There is something almost fitting about the fact that the myth centers on a helmet. A helmet conceals while it identifies. It hides part of the face and turns the wearer into a role warrior, ruler, defender, conqueror, ceremonial figure. In the Viking Age, a rare iron helmet protected a vulnerable human head and marked access to wealth or martial standing. In modern memory, the horned helmet performs the opposite function. It protects the viewer from complexity. Place it on a Norseman, and the uncomfortable uncertainty of the real world disappears behind a stable outline. No need to ask whether he is a trader or a raider, a farmer seeking seasonal wealth, a captive forced into another household, an elite follower of a king, a settler who will spend far more time clearing land than drawing a sword, or a poet whose power lies in language. The horns declare that he belongs to the category already waiting for him. They make him instantly knowable, and therefore prevent him from being known more deeply. The strange journey of those horns reaches across 3,000 years of northern history without ever forming the continuous tradition popular culture imagines. In the Bronze Age, magnificent horned helmets are placed into a Danish wetland, likely in a ritual act whose meaning is lost but whose visual force survives. Across prehistoric and early medieval imagery, horned, bird-crowned or animal-linked figures appear in contexts suggesting ceremony, authority, myth, or transformation. In the Viking Age itself, the rare helmets that can be securely connected to warriors are practical objects of iron, scarce and precious, without the famous projections. Medieval writers preserve fear of Scandinavian attack and later memories of Norse heroes, but do not establish the horned raider. Many centuries later, romantic artists, nationalist thinkers, illustrators and theatrical designers draw upon the dramatic vocabulary of the ancient North and fix horns onto legendary northern figures. Opera enlarges the silhouette until it becomes almost inseparable from pagan grandeur. Mass culture then removes the helmet from its artistic origin and distributes it around the world as though it had simply been waiting in the soil all along. At no point does this require a conspiracy, a single careless scholar or a public too foolish to accept correction. The process is more ordinary and more revealing. People prefer images that communicate rapidly. Artists choose forms that carry emotion. Audiences remember what is distinctive. Commerce repeats what sells. Humour repeats what produces recognition. Children inherit pictures before they inherit caveats. Each generation receives an object already familiar enough that it no longer seems to require evidence. The horned helmet becomes traditional, not because Viking warriors traditionally wore it, but because modern people traditionally depict them wearing it. That difference is small in appearance and enormous in meaning. This is how cultural memory often works. It does not preserve the past in an untouched chamber. It gathers fragments, rearranges them, brightens some, darkens others, borrows from neighbouring eras and turns ambiguity into emblem. A ruler known only through difficult sources becomes a national hero. A battle whose details are uncertain becomes the birth scene of a people. A ruin becomes a symbol of vanished greatness, even if the daily lives once lived around it are scarcely remembered. The Viking Age is especially vulnerable to this transformation because it offers so many powerful fragment ships rising from burial mounds, carved beasts twisting around metal, islands settled at the limits of endurance, raids recorded by frightened witnesses, poems filled with ravens and storms, gods walking toward doom, silver travelling thousands of miles, a shore reached across the Atlantic before later European voyages would redraw maps. The past already possesses drama. The horns merely provide a handle by which the imagination can lift the whole world at once. But a handle can also distort the weight it carries. The horned image concentrates attention upon a particular kind of masculinity: aggressive, wild, sea-born, armoured, loud, pagan, and almost always ready for battle. Under that helmet, whole categories of Viking Age existence fall into shadow. The skilled women whose textile labour produces sails and clothing, the people without freedom whose bodies and work sustain households and trade, the craftspeople whose combs, brooches, tools and carvings reveal a society capable of care, beauty and technical mastery, the merchants whose scales and weights tie Scandinavian ports to markets stretching toward distant empires, the converts and church builders whose choices complicate the easy picture of an eternally pagan North, the children, the sick, the elderly, the ordinary dead, the failed travellers, the victims of raids, the captives who never returned to the places from which they were taken. History simplified to one helmet is not merely inaccurate about headgear. It is selective about whose lives are allowed to represent an age. Even the warrior loses something beneath the horns. His actual equipment tells a richer story than the invention. The shield of wood and iron speaks of ordinary vulnerability and practical defence. The spear speaks of efficiency and reach, rather than romantic grandeur. The costly sword speaks of status, exchange, inheritance and gift-giving. The mail shirt speaks of labour, wealth, and the effort required to resist injury without ever becoming safe. The helmet from Gjermundbu, broken and darkened by burial, speaks of a body once important enough to be protected and mourned with expensive objects, yet now unrecoverable except through what endured beside him. No horns need rise above that iron. The battered object is moving precisely because it offers no theatrical escape. It belonged, in some form, to a life that could be wounded, frightened, ambitious, honoured and ended. There is humility in allowing an empty space to remain empty. Archaeology cannot tell us every ritual performed in Viking Age Scandinavia, every unusual headdress someone may once have worn, every meaning attached to the strange figures preserved on textiles or metal. The surviving evidence leaves room for exceptional costume, sacred display and images whose interpretation may continue to change. Scholars still debate these fragments because responsible history does not treat uncertainty as embarrassment. It treats it as part of the record. But humility also means refusing to fill the silence with the loudest available fantasy. The absence of horned combat helmets does not invite us to pretend they must have existed somewhere in the form we already know. It invites us to notice why we wanted them to exist so badly. Perhaps that desire begins with distance. The Viking Age is near enough to leave recognisable boats, tools, words, graves and human ambitions, but far enough to feel suspended in mist. Its inhabitants are not entirely strangers. They seek wealth, reputation, security, land, beauty, belief and belonging in ways still understandable. Yet their world includes practices, dangers and assumptions that resist modern comfort. Slavery is ordinary. Blood feud can shape families. Death at sea is common enough to hover behind every departure. Religion is present in acts and landscapes that cannot be translated cleanly. Power often rests upon the ability to command violence. The horned helmet makes this world safely theatrical. It signals distance before the details can trouble us. A man in horns is a character from elsewhere. A man in practical iron, carrying a shield while his ship carries stolen silver and captives, is disturbingly human. And yet myth is not simply an enemy to be defeated. Without later fascination, many people might never approach the Viking Age at all. The horned figure has acted as a bright, misleading signpost pointing toward a real landscape far more compelling than the symbol. A child drawn by the image of a fierce seafarer may eventually encounter longships engineered with astonishing skill, the poems of a complex oral culture, the ruins of Atlantic settlement. The networks of trade linking north and south, and the ethical shadows cast by raid and enslavement. The correction need not drain the past of wonder. It can deepen wonder by showing that genuine history is not the dull remainder left after legend is removed. It is the source from which legend borrowed its energy and then simplified it. The clearest answer to the question that began this journey is therefore both simple and carefully bounded. Viking warriors did not, as a normal practice, sail into raids and battles wearing the famous horned helmets attached to them by modern imagery. No convincing Viking Age combat helmet with such horns supports that belief. Horned headgear existed in much older Scandinavian ritual contexts. And unusual horn-like or bird-like headpieces may appear in rare symbolic images associated with the wider Norse world. But the everyday horned Viking is a creation shaped largely in the 19th century and spread through theatre, art, print, advertising, film, humour and popular culture. The answer removes a costume. It does not remove mystery. If anything, it reveals how many mysteries have been concealed beneath an image too easy to accept. Return, one last time, to the coast under the hammered sky. The ship is nearer now than it was at the beginning. Its hull is not an emblem but wood worked by hands. Its sail is not a dramatic backdrop but woven labour stretched against weather. Along the rail, shields overlap in the dull light. Behind them stand men whose faces can finally be imagined without the mask later centuries forced upon them. One wears an iron helmet if he's wealthy or fortunate enough to possess it. Others may be bareheaded beneath hoods or caps, cold rain in their hair. Their weapons are real, their reasons mixed, the danger they bring immediate. Nothing above their brows separates them from humanity. The imagined horns have vanished into the mist from which they came, but their outline remains faintly visible behind the scene, not as Viking equipment, but as our own reflection upon the past. They remind us that history can be conquered without ships, altered without fire, and disguised without deliberate lies. It can be given one irresistible image, repeated until the image seems older than evidence. Beneath it, the real helmet waits dark, broken, hornless, silent. It offers no easy symbol. Only the difficult gift of closeness to a world that was never simple, never entirely recoverable, and far more compelling than the costume remembered in its place. The sea settles when the ship is gone. Water folds over the track of the keel. Gulls turn in the wind, and the shoreline returns to the same patient silence it held before sails appeared on the horizon. Somewhere inland, beneath grass and roots, iron continues its slow surrender to the earth. A shield boss darkens in soil. A broken blade rests beside bones whose name has been lost. A comb, a buckle, a bead, a weight for silver, a rivet from a ship. Each holds a smaller truth than legend usually wants, and for that reason a more intimate one. They do not announce an age with thunder. They endure quietly, carrying fragments of lives that were once as immediate and uncertain as our own. The Vikings did not need horns to become unforgettable. They crossed seas that could kill them without ceremony. They built vessels light enough to run onto a beach and strong enough to reach beyond the familiar world. They planted farms in difficult ground, traded across continents, shaped poetry dense with memory, raised stones for the dead, changed kingdoms, suffered hunger, inflicted suffering, sought fortune, lost homes, made new ones, and left behind traces too complicated for any single image to contain. Their world was neither the heroic dream later centuries desired, nor only the nightmare recorded by those who saw ships approaching in fear. It was human, ingenious and violent, beautiful and harsh, filled with labour, ambition, belief, grief, and the endless uncertainty of what lies beyond the next stretch of water. Perhaps that is why the horned helmet lasted so long. It made distance comfortable. It turned a difficult people into a recognisable shape, a silhouette that could be admired, feared or laughed at without requiring too much closeness. But the past becomes richer when the costume is removed. A corroded helmet without horns leaves room for the person who wore it. A ship without caricature returns attention to the hands that built it. A raid without theatrical monsters forces us to see human choices and human consequences. The mystery does not vanish when the myth is corrected. It simply becomes deeper, quieter, and more honest. Even now, under museum light, the surviving iron cannot tell us everything. It cannot give back a face, a voice, the sound of a particular crossing, or the last thoughts of someone buried with weapons in northern soil. It cannot explain every strange image, every ritual object, every memory reshaped by time. But it can ask something of us to look carefully, to let uncertainty remain where certainty has not been earned, and to understand that history is often most powerful where it refuses the easy outline. Far out beyond the shore, evening gathers over dark water, no horned silhouette rises against the sky. Only a sail, briefly visible in the fading light, moving into distance until sea and memory close behind it.